It's been 3,000 years since the last Pokemon Ecology video, but now we're back! For as I have delved deep into the ecology of the world of Pokemon from Kanto through Alola, we have to return back to Kalos, as Lumiose City has transformed itself into a green city meant to house people and Pokemon together. Entire wild zones dedicated to Pokemon as they dig through the earth, surf through flowing streams, even fly high above the rooftops. Each Pokemon claiming a habitat for their own before wild zones are used to contain them and the threat of Lumiose. All because, unfortunately, the flow of life energy has been disrupted. A great power rising within the city being the reason for all these wild Pokemon being drawn here, and here is where we find the secret as to why Mega Pokemon are appearing without trainers at their side. And now, after scouring the alleys of Lumiose, racing across rooftops, surviving encounters with Alpha Pokemon, quelling Megas, and completing the Pokedex, I can now bring to you the complete ecology of Lumiose City! Howdy there, I'm Krellick, and I'm beyond excited to talk about ZA's ecology. It really feels as though I was just destined to talk about this ever since the first ecology video on this channel before Legends ZA was even released, or the trailers of it. Now, while I have worked my way through this city, I am one man. As such, I may use some extra details from Cerebi.net and Bulbapedia to help me with some of these finer details and relevant spawn points outside of the area zones or wild zones. The interesting thing about Pokemon in these zones is that they are able to break out, but the game itself allows us to use the Pokedex in order to find their natural habitat. For example, we might see Gumi on rainy days, though its primary habitat is within Lumiose's sewer system, where things are always damp as this little slug likes it. As such, once again, I will be using their primary habitats to help us find their niche within the ecosystem. After all, the study of ecology is the study of interactions between creatures and their environment, in addition to interactions between creatures and each other. If I tried to worry about every single spot that a Pidgey lands, we'd be here forever, and this would get too repetitive and you'd click off the video because it's boring. I'm also making this decision because the Pokedex does note things such as when Pokemon have made habitats outside of the wild zones. This would include Pokemon such as Riolu, who are often found in high places when it's sunny. And there's a good reason for that, which I will explain later. And while we don't get many direct interactions we can see, the game makes it very clear that there are very strong reasons as to why every Pokemon exists within the zones that we find them in, and what interactions may occur outside of our view. To kick us off, there is zero possible way for me to talk about this city's ecology without mentioning Anj, the reason as to why everything even happens within the city to begin with. Now, Anj is a machine created by AZ with the purpose of absorbing and redistributing excess life energy, though the only way it can even distribute life energy is through the assistance of Mega Eternal Flow Wect, at least in a concentrated, proper manner. Without someone who can properly control the sheer amount of energy that is effectively being transformed into Mega Energy, then it has the chance of putting every single person within Lumiose and beyond the city at risk of death. Because yes, humanity is finally a part of the Pokemon ecology video, though there's only so much that can really be talked about without getting repetitive once again, so I'll pepper in all the fun examples of Pokemon-human interactions that I have found. For now though, it is through the excessive amount of life energy coalescing into Lumiose, and more specifically into Prism Tower, that we find Pokemon being heavily attracted to the city. From here, AZ approached Quizartico and aimed to keep everything a secret, as AZ recognized that rogue Megas could appear here. And so the places where Pokemon gather the most were then transformed into wild zones, a secret attempt to ensure that if a rogue Pokemon were to appear, they would be contained and then appropriately handled. This isn't to say that these are prisons or perfect containments though. These are habitats specifically created, improved, or catered towards the Pokemon that have made their homes within the city. Otherwise, they just kind of completely took it over and we haven't really had to do anything other than throw up a wall. And there are plenty of cases where regular and alpha Pokemon have escaped from these zones and into the city, causing problems of their own. A lot of the time, they're weirdly attracted to the Hollowvators because of the energy that they release for some strange reason. And since I've now mentioned them, this excess life energy doesn't just result in Mega Pokemon. It results in Alpha Pokemon as well. I talk about this a lot in a previous video if you want to have all the details broken down for you, but I'll save the time here. As the game continues though, we find more wild zones springing up overnight. This isn't just a game thing, it is directly noted in conversation that these changes are happening overnight, all while crystals are forming all over the city as they are formed through the condensing of Mega energy within the atmosphere here. Actually, theoretically speaking, there are 3 ways that Mega energy is actually moved, whether that be through convection, and I don't remember the other 2 off the top of my head because that wasn't my focus here. Now, I will say I often claimed that Pokemon may be eating or absorbing these crystals, which would also explain why we find so many Pokemon in areas where the crystals occur most, but considering that Pokemon have other ways to absorb latent energy in the atmosphere naturally, they may not need to consume these crystals at all. This will make way more sense later when we get to talk about Xerneas and Area 20. We'll also make sure to talk far more about Ange later on, because there's more to it than meets the eye. Now, with all of this out of the way and the basis for our understanding of how this city functions, let's dig into our Pokemon within Wild Zone 1. Wild Zone 1, be ready for attacks from wild Pokemon if you're going to enter this wild zone. Day, night, all kinds of weather, we will find every single Pokemon here at any time and in any condition. One Pokemon of note is Pidgey, with our conversation on these wild zones popping up to contain Mega Pokemon, now showing us that this is likely in the general area where the first Mega Pidgeot appeared, also the first Mega event that happened within the city before our arrival. Now, Pidgey are your average bird. They will fly far and wide but always return back home. They don't care for battling and will instead just use their abilities to whip away the grass and brush in order to expose their prey. This prey, of course, being bug Pokemon. In this specific instance, it would be Weedle and Scatterbug, which seems odd considering that they're all roughly the same size, a little over or a little under or exactly 1 foot tall. But Pokemon has a very strong tendency to stick to these predator-prey relationships despite size. Even more interestingly, with the right amount of strength, a lot of prey species are able to fight back or have the right defense mechanism necessary in order to survive, even more so if they're staying in groups to keep each other safe. Though, that doesn't always keep them alive and healthy. Other animals have to eat after all. Now with Pidgey and all the Pokemon here, they all do have the same chance of appearing, at least by data standards. So the same can't be said about their alpha chances, but we'll get there in a moment. Within this zone, the Pidgey are found on the rooftops where there's some grass and flowers, but they're able to use their gusts to reveal bug Pokemon here. Now, I only saw a Weedle up on the roof, without any other Scatterbug appearing, but I'll come back to that. Now, it's also appear on the rooftops that we have a 100% chance of encountering an Alpha Pidgey, which pays into that understanding that the Mega Pidgeot appeared here. It is pretty secluded, but with a bird this large and being more aggressive, it's safe to say that it has a wider range of food than you would normally expect of its species. Outside of this, Pidgey can be seen throughout the streets of Lumiose, doing as many of our other birds will do, landing on lampposts, flying around, maybe even pecking at the ground, you know, bird biz. Now, just below that Alpha Pidgey, standing in a small area sandwiched by a pond and an overpass that connects back to the city streets, is a Pichu. They are easy targets, unfortunately, tiny little mice that can't properly control their electric abilities whatsoever. They'll send off little bits of electricity with any strong emotion that they have, making them a bit dangerous for anyone who would want to go near them. And here's where I have to make an important distinction in how this analysis is done and how real life works. Pidgey, even when it is an alpha, may still not be eating Pichu, though it would still be higher on the food chain if you want to talk about the food chain. This is simply because you will never see a Pichu actively trying to hunt down any other Pokemon, as it is effectively a prey species. And I know Pokemon becomes a lot more confusing because we have ambulatory plants running around, having emotions and making faces at us, but in all reality, plants in the real world are also being studied, as a side note, to potentially have a level of sentience that is just different from ours, so it's no more complicated than the real world, technically speaking. Effectively, the only thing to figure out then is what plants are Pokemon like Pichu eating, considering we know that it does eat berries at least. Are they just eating plants, or are their diets expanding into plant Pokemon, or having to pull berries from plant Pokemon like Snover, who aren't in this area, of course. Well, when we look at the rest of the Pichu's line, unlike regular mice who will eat insects, plants, seeds, and pretty much whatever else they can get their hands on, the Pichu line and most of their cousins actually stick to eating berries, and I'd still say they're eating seeds as well, making for a peaceful life by the pond where they get their fill of water and can prevent themselves from being startled as they seclude themselves from all other Pokemon in the area. That's why they are here by themselves. We also might as well talk about our other bird in the area, Fletchling, who currently doesn't have any firepower on their side and isn't all that different from a robin. Though at least within these wild areas, they're fairly docile and friendly until you decide to throw a Pokeball or attack them. Then they will become very territorial and attack you, and everything else is now seen as a threat. Now, its evolved forms are very clearly predators, and robins within the real world are known to eat worms, insects, grubs, snails, fruit, and berries. So it becomes a bit of a mix-up as to what it could be eating. Though considering we have both Weedle and Scatterbug as previously stated, I say it is safe to say that it will be attempting to get its fill of both bugs and fruit in the area. In fact, it may have had some better luck with Scatterbug, which would explain then why Fletchling sticks closer to the ground, while Pidgey is primarily found on the rooftops. Maybe they have some level of territorial dispute. Alternatively though, Fletchling could just be focusing more on eating berries, allowing Scatterbug to feel safe out in the open as it moves around. Hard to say for sure. That is though, at least until Pidgey attack from above, since they're definitely watching from their vantage point above the streets. Basically, to explain better, they're using the rooftops in place of the tree line as birds would do in a forest. Though, now we can also talk about our two bugs transitioning into Weedle, who is able to protect itself with its big ol' needle on its head, or the one on its tail for that matter, though it's not always going to be the best deterrent. Its best bet is actually going to be sticking to the shadows and brush nearby, while eating as many leaves as it can so it can eventually evolve into Kakuna, as we'll see in other areas. If anything, considering Fletchling seems to have a longer beak than Pidgey, there's a chance that Fletchling within Lumiose are able to get around those needles a bit easier to make prey of these Weedle. This would even explain why there's a Weedle on the rooftop completely out in the open despite a Pidgey being nearby, because Pidgey have shorter, blunter beaks, so it might not actually be able to reach the Weedle without some risk of damage or harm or whatever you want to say. The Weedle either A, is simply not afraid, or it's just very stupid. It all depends on just how effective those needles are. Meanwhile, when we look at Scatterbug, it definitely seems more comfortable on the ground level despite the number of Fletchling, and we won't find any of them on the rooftops, at least not here. Another reason we likely don't see them up there is because they won't find their food of choice up on the rooftop. For as we look throughout Lumiose's rooftops, we'll find green roofs everywhere, places where grass and flowers have been planted. And this will technically be a bit of a tangent, so bear with me, as this is an important part of Lumiose's ecology anyway, and I have to use the real world to explain this. With all these planter boxes, these swaths of grass, the flowers, and even whole trees in some places, it creates a number of fantastic special environments or resting spots for animals in the real world and Pokemon in their world. Although, I was also never taught to plant a whole freaking tree on a rooftop, so maybe don't do that unless you're sure that it won't grow too large to destroy the roof by crashing down, growing too heavy, or that it won't dig its roots into your ceiling. Also, yes, I say roof like roof and roots like roots. Deal with it, I guess. Bear with me. Now, I digress, because it is through these manicured roofs of green that we can reduce heat within a city. Water can be captured and even cleaned naturally, allowing for some potential extra uses. And it may also just serve to help a little animal in need of a little bit of help. Whether that be a bug looking for a meal or shelter, or a bird searching for a safe place to rest on their journey. Of course, this all depends on what the green roof's purpose is constructed for, but it definitely seems as though most of the green construction within Lumiose is an attempt to keep the city cooler while also aiding the Pokemon that may wander around outside of the wild zones. But since these rooftops are far more tended to or manicured than these wild zones, it means that Scatterbug's choice of food, poisonous leaves, and roots, told you we'd come back around, will likely not be found. This isn't to say it's impossible. In fact, there are a few places in which you might find Scatterbug, but you will definitely also find Spupa and Vivian upon the rooftops. But those are often sections where other predator species aren't as close by, allowing them to feel safe. Because if they don't eat these poisonous flora, then they are unable to produce the black powder that paralyzes their predators on contact, thus making them defenseless. This is why they have to stick close to the ground. This is why they have to find these poisonous leaves and poisonous roots, and this is why you will not find them on the rooftops as often as you will find them on the ground. So pretty much every Pokemon here has an effect on another, and we can see how they would interact, even if Pichu is all by itself. Though, what about the Mareep that you find here, you may ask? Well, it's not doing much. It's enjoying its time peacefully in the area that would be closest to the professor's lab, funnily enough. None of the other Pokemon are going to bother it. Mareep just doesn't care about bothering any other Pokemon, and it's gonna just graze upon the grass as it pleases. Theoretically speaking, now that I think about it, Mareep might be taming the grass because it's eating so much of it, and allows there to be open patches for these bugs to have to move between, thus allowing the insect population within these wild zones to be well taken care of, or at least controlled, by the birds that do appear on the rooftops or in the area generally. Also would like to imagine, not that it's necessarily true, that the Mareep might be used as electricity for the lab from time to time, because it's a little funny to me. With this wild area, it has plenty of greenery for our smaller Pokemon to hide in, rock faces for others to make shelter from, and the water that flows through here moves outwards and towards the canal fairly clearly, as we are now within Wild Zone 2. This is important though, as the moving water helps keep things fresh and clean, assuming there isn't a bunch of sediment being moved around as well. My old stream studies are coming out. Though, hopefully, what is being moved around are microorganisms and necessary nutrients for the area here. And I believe there are, as we have Pokemon such as Bidoof here, who rely on clean water and nutritious soil to become healthier, stronger, and have more potent poisonous spores. Hooray for all of us. It's a shy little guy, of course, and will avoid conflict, but it is immediately found at the entrance away from other Pokemon. They're unfortunately a Pokemon that would get attacked by any herbivorous Pokemon that may be interested in hunting plant Pokemon. As a clarification again, not all grass Pokemon are actually plants. I make the assumption that the Bidoof line are basically the Pokemon equivalent of Pikmin, ambulatory plants that mimic muscle fibers while still being a plant but allowing them to then move, while other grass types such as Bulbasaur are frogs that have a symbiotic nature with the plant that grows on their back. And then there are of course many other ones that just have plant powers or power over nature itself while not being a plant at all biologically. It makes things easier to then understand what Pokemon may decide to choose as their meal of choice. And if you want all the nitty-gritty details on that, I do have a complete food chain video you can watch after this one. Moving on though, Bidoof is doing its own thing, while as you cross the bridge, you'll find yourself accosted on either side by Magikarp. It seems like they're trying to attack you at first, which may cause you to strike them, but if you just wait and don't do anything at all, then they will just continually flop around without a care in the world. I found out though that the only exception to this is when there's an alpha version of the Pokemon, in which case these peaceful ones will become incredibly aggressive. These bad boys can survive in space, so don't worry. Being out of the water for a little bit of time shouldn't really hurt them. They're like the tardigrades of the Pokemon world, which tardigrade based Pokemon would go pretty hard. Adorable little water bear, please give it to me. That and Plankton in the Pokemon world. Now, Magikarp are bottom feeders at the end of the day. They aren't actually hunting for anything, and then they are also effectively no different than any other Asian carp that we would find in a small decorative pond. Though, of course, this pond is not actually decorative. The Magikarp will likely dig up sediment, eat whatever scraps of food people might throw at them, and live a pretty simple life. They're also found throughout the waterways of the entire city, even in spaces where it seems like they really shouldn't be, just because I assume they're getting their way through the sewer systems, any of the canals, you name it, which, I mean, technically they aren't found in the sewer systems at all, but they're found just outside of them all the time. And would you guess it, Asian carp are an invasive species within Paris and do make their way through the waterways, meaning that our Magikarp here could effectively be an invasive species within at least Lumiose City. I should also clarify, Asian carp is, to my understanding, a grouping of 4 different kinds of carp: bighead, silver, grass, and black. We would specifically be talking about the big-headed carp as one of the 3 invasive carp that entered Paris. Invasive species are also usually defined as being either harmful to the economy and other native animals that exist within the area. This is through not being known to the resident species, meaning that those resident species will not interact with it or even try to eat it. I've seen a spider completely ignore an Asian beetle that, you know, it looks like a ladybug. You wouldn't think about anything else from a distance, but the stench that they let off, it went directly under the spider and passed right on through. That is just how much invasive species can just get away with doing whatever they want. And because of that, these species are able to run rampant. In addition, they can have special traits that allow them to survive better and outcompete other animals, resulting in them completely taking over as they overpopulate areas and destroy food supplies. And it's not just animals, it's also plants. So, I'm sorry Magikarp, but I might just have to put out a hit order on your entire species, though in fact, thanks to an individual known as Professor Breyer, it was pointed out to me that carp fishing is pretty popular in France, which would then mean it's likely that this is their means in the real world of getting rid of the population. And then, of course, I could take this one step further, because at least within the Pokemon world, every Pokemon appearing within this city is being attracted to the power of Anj. So it's really hard to say what is or isn't actually invasive for sure when we don't know what the rest of Kalos looks like after these past 5 years since the events of X and Y. In addition, they are supposed to be tasty while also having natural predators here in Kalos, so Magikarp's population may be kept in check just fine and is not an invasive species whatsoever. It all depends on what the rest of the environment looks like and what the rest of Kalos looks like overall. Once you're across the bridge though, you'll come into contact with your first Binacle. Now, these will commonly make their homes near or within water as you would expect of a barnacle, though they are more specifically goose barnacles in design, being filter-feeding crustaceans that do attach to hard surfaces of rock. So when you find them on tiles and shallow water, or you find them in the flowing waters of the canal or near pipe exits where the water flows past them, they're getting their fill of food as best they can. And it is a buffet for them. They still act as a bit of a proper barnacle from time to time as well, with a side mission focusing on how they keep jumping onto a man's boat, similar to how stereotypical barnacles would attach themselves to boats, except they're actually riding inside of it. Long story short here, we battle them and then they still try to jump onto the boat, and it is after the battle that we then understand that they just want to ride on the boat and don't have any ill intent whatsoever. From then onwards, you can always find the Binacle group chilling out on the guy's boat, and they are the captain now. What's interesting about this game in particular is that it puts a high emphasis on the #1 way to understand people in Pokemon is through a Pokemon battle. It's almost like the emotions or feelings of an individual are properly conveyed through the battle spirit or the emotional spirit or whatever the heck else you want to call it when a battle is occurring, thus allowing you to pick up on these feelings and understand them fully, even if you're not participating in the battle directly. Now, Binacle here in Wild Zone 2 don't really have to worry about any predators here. Honestly, none of the Pokemon here do, because the closest we have is Patrat, who isn't actually attacking other Pokemon at all. Throughout my Ecology series, in any other location, Patrat and even Watchog have never been consistently around any other Pokemon that they could call prey. Despite being based on chipmunks and meerkats, their diets don't include insects or scorpions or anything. Instead, they fill their stomachs with berries and plant life in ways that don't involve hunting other Pokemon, but rather foraging. They can then use any seeds they gain as ammunition for defense. And the fun thing about these guys is that they are constantly on the lookout for other Pokemon or threats overall. Whether it be here, on rooftops, or many other places that will place them, they are constantly positioning themselves where they can see more of the area around them via distance or higher ground, and we'll talk about them more later. Another Pokemon you'll find here stuck to a tree is Kakuna. They are completely defenseless and can still use their little spike to shank you with poison, but otherwise they're doing their best to bide their time before they can finally evolve. You get it? Bide. Now, I do find it odd that specifically Kakuna are here, yet we never find Weedle or Beedrill in this Wild Zone. It is very well noted that the Wild Zones, though, aren't perfect, and Pokemon can escape from time to time. So maybe theoretically speaking, some Weedle find this to be the safest place for them to become Kakuna. It would make sense as this is a very peaceful area with no real predators. It would then easily allow it to save its energy without any stress and evolve sooner into Beedrill, where it can then escape the area. After all, it is one of the higher level Pokemon in this area if we don't include our alpha Pokemon. So as a side theory, maybe these wild zones are made to hold a range of power, which would primarily be the Mega Pokemon or similarly Alpha Pokemon, but other Pokemon can make it through the cracks. So in order to prevent this, the habitats are specialized to be more enticing and keep the Pokemon there. This isn't to say the wild zones don't do their job, but again, we know there are those that can get out, and trust me, even game mechanic wise, I have been attacked from Pokemon on the opposite side of the fence, and even seen Pokemon use Dig to escape and hit me. It is terrifying! Now as I cool my jets, our last Pokemon to talk about before we talk about our alphas would be Staryu, who only appears at night. And Staryu gets a little crazy in this game in my personal opinion, though that's mainly when we talk about Starmie later on. Staryu is very interesting because now we can clearly and factually state that they come from space originally. Not to say that every single one of the Staryu that we see is born in space, because, you know, you can breed Staryu here on the planet, but they originally come from space. They communicate to the stars at night with their flashing lights, and we can assume, similar to Starmie, that they eat plankton, making half of this wild zone purely filter feeders. They're not only in the water, but also walking around on land, which is a bit scary until you realize that starfish can actually walk around like that, to some degree. They even use preferred limbs to help them stand up as though they were arms like our own, which that might actually terrify you even more, knowing that this is based on reality. Now, there isn't much to see about all of these Pokemon because most of their interactions are with the environment itself and not with each other. They're very separated from each other on different sections, almost islands, if you would, which is fine. That's still ecology, baby. What is interesting is that we also do get a 100% guarantee of seeing an Alpha Magikarp in the daytime and an Alpha Staryu at night. From here on, though, I will, just to save my breath, call them fixed alphas. Keeping these in mind, and knowing this is one of the first zones, we would then assume that this would have been where another Mega Rogue appeared, or was expected to appear, which you would then assume was either Mega Gyarados or Starmie. Despite this, the Rogue Pokemon that appears closest to this area is actually the Mega Beedrill, who appears in Vert Sector 5. This Mega Evolution really doesn't play that big of a part on the environment other than it being an event, but there will be Rogue Megas that appear later on that may better coincide with what happens ecologically. Otherwise, this is honestly just a nice and peaceful area, a stroll in a small park if you would, as long as you don't have a phobia of fish flying towards you. Wild Zone 3 is a strange place to me. It feels more like a very manicured urban area that got taken over by Pokemon rather than a wild zone that was built for them, especially as we have trimmed hedges, patterned grass, and a tower that overlooks the city and this area, of course. As a note, the 4 sections with the centerpiece show a Pokeball, Badoo, Roselia, and Roserade alongside a Roserade statue for your first hint of these designs within the ground. It feels very Parfum Palace in its design, very royal themes here, especially as we look at some of the Pokemon we do find here. In one section, we find Skiddo, sticking to the grassier areas by themselves. While all the areas have bushes, these are less manicured and may just have better hiding spots for them. Maybe they can get more sunlight here. Maybe that's why these bushes are so large in comparison to the other sections, which are squared hedges. At the end of the day, though, Skiddo don't actually need to eat anything as long as they're getting enough sunlight and water. In fact, considering they are domesticated species of Pokemon, they may actually like this semi-city, semi-natural design. And the same could be calming to many of the other Pokemon that we have in this zone. Also, for ease, if I don't mention that they are exclusive to certain weather or certain times of the day, then assume that any Pokemon I mention are found at all times and in any weather. There are actually very few exceptions throughout the entirety of the game. And the same areas that we would find Skiddo are the same that I, at least, was able to find Pancham. It is the only dark-type Pokemon here, meaning that it won't be evolving into Pangoro anytime soon, though it will likely still find someone to emulate in behavior, because that's just what they do. Pangoro itself, to explain or help us explain Pancham better, is a Pokemon that does hunt for prey. And to be entirely fair, pandas don't always just eat bamboo or foliage. But without a figure to teach Pancham to hunt, it may actually not learn to hunt after other Pokemon, making it have a different behavior than usual. This is actually something that we can say about a number of other Pokemon within Lumiose City. Though, at least in Pancham's case, there could be the exception that, let's say, Litleo, who's also in this area, might be teaching it. But we'll get to that later. Instead, Pancham may be getting plenty of its fill from the flora we find in this zone, alongside the occasional snacking from any greenery that Skiddo has on its body if Pancham decides to get a little bit more daring. What's more interesting to me, though, is that when Pancham did appear, I didn't see any Skiddo. This is something that can help us figure out Pokemon relationships. And in the case of Pancham, I don't think it would actually be hunting Skiddo, but might be a little bit antagonistic towards it. Kind of like how some Pokemon will bother Snover for their berries. And since I mentioned Litleo, let's actually move across the pond here, well, across the grass rather, and talk about them within their section. Because Litleo are, of course, lion cubs, and any cat is noted to be an obligate carnivore. Though even this is to always be taken with a grain of salt, because every single creature in the world will eat anything if they're desperate. And I've mentioned this in a number of different videos, but animals like tortoises, for example, have been seen hunting birds and succeeding. I just, try to stick to what our Pokemon's most realistic and common diet would be when I do talk about all this. Back to Litleo though, they're noted to be quick to start fights and are able to hunt on their own once they are taught by a female Pyroar. This actually lines up with the real world, as lionesses are the backbone of the pride. They do most of the hunting, teaching, grooming, and initiate mating time, because lions are kind of deadbeats until they're forced to do something, girl power. This actually then makes me question if Litleo would actually be hunting other Pokemon. Though if it isn't, then people will have to make sure it's getting necessary meals and nutrients, or else they would be struggling to survive even within a safe place such as this wild zone. Plus, hate to admit it, but natural instinct will eventually kick in, and it will eventually attack another Pokemon in order to survive. At the absolute least, I would be more than willing to bet that between Litleo being quick to start fights and Pancham being of similar rebellious ilk, that the two would be clashing a decent amount, keeping each other in check, making sure one doesn't dominate the area more than the other. Though, in all reality, this may even help us explain why we find a fixed Alpha Litleo here, because it is fighting a lot. It is being a bit of an antagonist, and it was the one that fought enough and was filled with enough excess energy from the area to become stronger, to become this alpha. Now, there might be one other fun detail to this, because in a number of wild areas, we will find alpha Pokemon that otherwise do not have a population of non-alpha forms in the zone. In this case, at the top of the tower, if you climb up those funny little steps, you will encounter a fixed alpha fletchling that is a higher level than the alpha Litleo, making it the highest level in this area overall, though you will otherwise not encounter any fletchling in this wild zone. And this tells us a bit of a story and may explain our ecology here. As stated, Pokemon are not perfectly contained by these wild zones. Least of all, our flying Pokemon are definitely not, as we find them all over the city, and with Pokemon such as Pidgeot, Talonflame, and Hawlucha, they are Pokemon that are only found in high places. These high places are their vantage points, locations that they can nest safely away from others, maybe build up a family, and then when they need to, they can use their sharp vision to spot prey anywhere in the city around them. They're then able to spread their massive wings and take flight. It would actually be very, very cruel to keep these Pokemon entirely in containment, as they would not have the space necessary to feel comfortable or to exercise. And so, these large winged bird Pokemon aren't kept in said enclosed spaces, but one of the smaller birds. If they could so freely roam the city streets and wild areas while making habitats for themselves in a number of different wild zones, what does it mean for the Pokemon in those zones? Well, it means that we will find that bird Pokemon will wander their way into some of these zones and simply become meals for other Pokemon. The same can be said about any other flying type Pokemon, any other bug that flies, you name it. Which then, my theory is this. Wild Zone 3, oh my god, that was the nerdiest thing I could have done adjusting my glasses. My theory is then this. Wild Zone 3 is not a habitat for fletchling because Litleo will hunt and eat them here. Because of this, with enough battling and encounters, an alpha fletchling appeared, being able to secure the roof for itself and other fletchlings that may fly by. This then, in turn, causes Litleo to keep attacking and trying to win until eventually an alpha Litleo came into existence, though that alpha Litleo is still not quite strong enough to topple this alpha fletchling. This then would solve our moral and ecological issue of throwing in a lion cub with a number of other Pokemon that we would find here that would be vulnerable to being attacked by Litleo. Pokemon that we would expect to have to constantly fight for their lives. One Pokemon would then be Esper, a timid, little adorable cat that was having trouble, or does have trouble, controlling its abilities to begin with. One wrong tug of the ear means you'll uncover their ear holes and get blasted to Kingdom Come, and so they isolate themselves pretty often. Funnily enough, the first time I actually ran into one was on the rooftops. It is a cat after all, so I'm not going to question how it got up there. Though, since it is a cat, we have yet another obligate carnivore that adds to this strange situation we are in if we don't consider stray bird Pokemon as a meal. Also, before I forget, because I didn't write it in my script, because of this area having a lot of regal or royalist themes to it, I mean, we have a lion, which is, of course, having the heraldry of the lion. We have fletchling, which you can associate with Talonflame, being a hawk and being another piece of heraldry. We have this Esper, who is a small, adorable cat, and a lot of royal people within a number of different places, or high figures. You look at Giovanni, you look at Alola, would have cats as their primary pet, so on and so forth. It's just this little area that has a lot of royal themes to it overall, and I'll have to explore that in a different video in the future. In the last section that we have within this wild zone, though, we get a bunch of Pikachu, which actually bothers me a little bit, considering that Pikachu are only noted to eat berries in the wild. I know I want to assume that they eat seeds as well, yet we don't see any berries here whatsoever, though that might just be me nitpicking the details of the game. In addition, a crowding of Pikachu can cause a thunderstorm to form, as lightning will then strike down on the group and revitalize their energy. Great for them, but yet another nightmare for any flying Pokemon who would take a trip to this zone. And because I started realizing the pattern here, I had to look it up and double check that pandas will also eat birds and their eggs, even if they rarely do so. So effectively, screw any birds that decide to fly through here, I guess, because this wild zone is just an absolute nightmare. I can understand why now we have this alpha fletchling here. It's fighting for its freaking life. Now, the only saving grace here is that Skiddo is friendly, and actually, so is Flabebe, who you will find here. Not necessarily found in any specific section, and Flabebe, at least within the Pokedex, is noted to be found in flower pods or bushes, and that is pretty true, since wherever you find a colored flower, you will likely find a Flabebe of that color nearby. And as such, even though Flabebe is noted to appear within this wild zone is not considered a habitat through the Pokedex of Flabebe. And I will say, at least that this zone is noted to be able to have red, blue, and white Flabebe, though I think you could understand that, you know, I didn't get to see them all, and that comes down to just pure chance at this point. Now, Flabebe have a symbiotic nature with their flowers. They can survive without them. In fact, they are born without a flower and may wait forever before choosing the flower that they want to care for the rest of their known lifespan, which, if we look at Forges, is probably an incredibly long time, 300 years at a minimum. Though the only issue is that they are, Flabebe, effectively unsafe without the flower, as they use it to draw out power from it while also caring for it. Luckily, they shouldn't really have any threats here, as even Fletchender isn't gonna care about eating their flower or eating the fairy Pokemon. You don't really know what it is. You know, you might think it's a fungus, you might think it's just a fairy, you might think it's an alien. Hard to say for sure. We just know it's a fairy-type Pokemon, and usually fairy types are associated with celestial power, life power, flow of life, or aliens in general. Digressing from that though, this effectively means that this Pokemon is the reason as to why all the flowers and foliage is likely kept healthy here. It of course isn't going to have the same degree of effect as what Florges has, but you know, Flabebe has to learn and start from somewhere in order to build the skill and habit that it will eventually master in its evolutions. And even if it doesn't stay here, it would make sense that this is one of the many places that Flabebe may gather to get flowers and then float off throughout this city. In fact, I am pretty sure that's exactly what happens. They float away, eventually evolve, and continue to help care for all of the flora throughout Lumiose, keeping themselves, other Pokemon, and even people happy and healthy through the added greenery that now resides here. And what's funny about this is that this whole wild zone has a huge rose motif to it, something that might have greater implications in a future video that I'll have to talk about. Now, funnily enough, while searching for Pidgeot footage, I actually ran into a shiny white flower Flabebe high up on the rooftops. It took me a second to register that it was a shiny and felt like a little blessing for what I was doing, which is me being over dramatic and goofy, but whatever. And before we do go to our next zone, if you're aware of the anomalous alphas that appear here and in 2 other sections, don't worry, I'll cover them later. They are noted to be an anomaly by Mabel for a reason and have a different ecological connection that we will talk about. And I do want to say, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you're enjoying this so far and you're new to the channel, please do make sure you subscribe. I release videos every single week, and they are just as deep, if not deeper, dives than what I'm doing here, with a lot of focus on connecting Pokemon into the real world. In addition, leave any comments behind on anything that might expand on what I'm saying or might prove what I'm saying wrong. I am happy to be proven wrong with the right evidence, as I want to make sure that I'm getting this right and we're working together as a community to build on what exists within this world and making it more interesting together. In addition, comments and watch time are the #1 way to freely support a video and help it boost around and get more reach, other than hyping the video as well, which you can do. If you would like to go the extra mile, you can become a member for as little as $3 a month, which gets you behind the scenes access to videos early, and some extra posts that I do here or there, just talking to members of the community. But once again, thank you so much for watching, and on with the video. Zone 4 is our graveyard, which is pretty clever since there is the Japanese superstition of associating the number 4 with death itself. Now, I will always say I wish we got the French catacombs, but oh well. Might have been a bit too much for Pokemon, I suppose. But after ending the war, the bodies have to go somewhere, right? Anywho, we get to see Patrat here again, but only at night, making it work the graveyard shift as I make sure there aren't any grave robbers moving around these parts. In addition, a big reason it probably doesn't appear during the day is because we actually find Ekans during the day here. One of which actually surprised me, scared me, if I have to be honest, while I was trying to study Spupa behavior. It straight up appeared from the nearby bush, and they continued to do so, acting as ambushed predators and then following me as best they can in order to attack. Being snakes, they would be trying to make meals of any stray Patrat that we can't find during the day. Though it is noted that snakes don't typically eat spiders, Ekans and even its evolution, Arbok, seem to not really care for the most part where their meals come from. It may actually even help us explain why we see an alpha Spinarak here alongside a regular population of Spinarak that are equal or lower in level to the lowest leveled Ekans we'd find here. Honestly, Ekans and Arbok just kind of mishmash a bunch of different traits from snakes together. They enjoy sleeping in trees, according to Pokemon Snap, they can swim, and it transforms from a rattlesnake into a king cobra with a magnificent hood. So it has a lot going on. As such, while typical snakes aren't going to be this way, I'm consistently stating that Ekans and Arbok will eat anything that has meat, including insects, but still has their preferred meal. With the Spinnerack I mentioned, they can be found clinging to gravestones mainly, though the greatest collection of them is on the mausoleum at the back of the Wild Zone. I'm not sure who is in that mausoleum, but clearly they're important, and it isn't AZ who's buried there, which is really interesting considering that he is royalty. You'd expect that he would have potentially been placed inside alongside what could be other royals of Kalos, but nope. And nevertheless, Alpha Spinnerack and a grouping of Spinnerack are on this wall. Pretty spooky for our arachnophobes out there, and considering their size and how there are spiders out there that do eat snakes and do eat birds and pretty much anything else, it may be safe to assume that with enough disputes between Spinnerack and Ekans, whoever wins in their battles becomes the meal. Especially as spiders a lot of the time end up being opportunistic predators. On the rare occasion, they might eat a little bit of sap, they might eat a little bit of grass, or not grass, but just plants in general, but it's really a case-by-case basis. And with enough aggression, Spinnerack somehow didn't evolve into Ariados, but rather gained its alpha from these conflicts. And scarier yet is that there is a whole side mission where someone had ruined one of their webs within the city accidentally, not on purpose, accidentally. And they were entirely wrapped up within a cocoon from Spinnerack. Once we freed them, the Spinnerack didn't attack again, but were definitely very unhappy until he apologized. There's also evidence, I will say here in the Wild Zone, that it may be a predator to Spupa, considering that Spupa are found pretty far away from this exact location where the Spinnerack group together. In fact, the Spupa kind of stick to corners of this place and are only found during the daytime. Reminds me of those little thick webs that spiders make in the corners of houses to hide themselves, and then they have their babies and so on and so forth, right? Now, the thing about Spupa and many of our other Pokemon here is that they use some sort of poison for attack or defense. Ekans uses poison and constriction. Spinnerack uses poison to weaken prey, but that poison is not strong enough to kill any of its prey. And Spupa has a poisonous black powder that actually paralyzes its attackers. It seems as though this graveyard may not be as tended to as it should be, or is at least representative of the natural decay that is occurring here. I'd like to believe that it is the latter of those two options. Now, back to Spupa, it's also just biding its time, hiding in the shadows of these thickets as it is building up the energy it needs in order to evolve, while hiding away from more common predators such as our avian friends. Other than Spinnerack though, the only other Pokemon that appears at all times is Ghastly, a Pokemon that often appears in graveyards, and at least within the games, it makes it very clear that Ghastly is born from the natural decay of bodies and likes to make residence wherever the wind won't blow them away into nothingness. There was also a Ghastly seemingly trying to make its way inside of this one building while I was getting footage, which is a terrifying thing to imagine considering that they will just envelop their prey in gas to suffocate them before consuming their life energy, and I almost guarantee that if air is getting through that window at all, so can a Ghastly. And apparently, even if you're a steel type like Caparaja, it doesn't matter. That gas is effective, so screw your immunities, you will die. Now, Ghastly is noted to have a sweet smell, despite the poisonous nature of its body. And a very strange thing is that the decay of a body in the real world can be sometimes described as a sickly sweet smell. Pretty clear as to one way these Pokemon are born. The other being due to industrial smog according to the Adventures manga, which we are in a city, though it seems as though Lumiose is a very, very green city from obvious reasons. Now, Ghastly aren't going to be a picky eater. They're just going to swoop in, suffocate whatever prey they can, and then move on with their lives. Though they may also be sucking up all those decaying smells into themselves as part of a balanced diet. It's like the Ghastly food group pyramid. It's like souls, life force, nasty, stinky, decaying gas, smog, because apparently they really like the taste of smog according to the Adventures manga, so I half imagine— oh wait, no, I just reversed the entire pyramid. Ooh, it's okay, most of you just listen to my videos anyway. Most of you don't actually watch it. That's fine. Now, the last of our Pokemon only appears at night, but it is a strange one to me, as we have Honedge. Now, with Honedge or Honedge, however you want to say it, I don't really care, it is stated to be born from a soul that attached to the sword that killed it. Though it is also very reminiscent in this exact scenario of one other yokai, known as the Tsukumogami, inanimate objects that have gained a soul after reaching 100 years of age. They are known to be either friendly or mischievous, depending upon how they were treated during their long existence. And while these are typically going to be tools, maybe things like umbrellas, straw sandals, apparently, kind of imagine a chancla being thrown at me, but it's a ghost, or other common objects, it seems as though it could just be any object whatsoever that becomes this Tsukumogami. This is not to say that every single gravestone here has a sword and everybody was a warrior, but that these Pokemon are representative of the many items left on graves that have been here for an incredibly long time. This would not be the graves of the people from 3,000 years ago, and I don't know for sure if the war that happened 300 years ago would have produced these gravestones here. Hard to know for sure. I will say, though, in respect to Honedge, there is a side quest that reveals to us that it needs to sharpen their blades regularly or they get sick. Meaning there is always the chance that they could be sharpening themselves on rocks or gravestones, other Pokemon, or would-be intruders daring enough to cause trouble in this place of rest. At least within the side quest, it was either a Larvitar or a Pupitar that it had to battle in order to sharpen itself on and then actually regain its good health. Another one of the side quests, now that we're talking about it, exactly one of the first side quests, introduces a Sableye that took a ring that an elderly lady had from when her husband passed away, which really early on, they kind of hits you in the back of the head over the fact that they really aren't hiding the fact that death is a very real thing in the Pokemon world in this game compared to how they talk about it in previous games. Now, back to the Sableye, it takes residence in this zone, but we never see another of its kind ever again after this event, adding once more to this idea of some Pokemon being able to make their way in and out of these zones, especially if they're not intended to be in these zones or they don't make their habitat here. Lastly, the Rogue Mega Ampharos that appeared closest to the zone within Rogue Sector 6 is coincidentally the closest that there is to this wild zone and is also nearby the Looker Bureau, with Emma having a Mega Ampharos herself, though the effect that this Pokemon has on the ecology is one that I did not find conclusive, and we can move on. Zone 5 describes itself as having spacious areas with very few hiding spots, even in the sewers, and yes, we can access the sewers from the zone, so we'll take a detour through the sewers before the next wild zone. Right away though, I encountered a grouping of Bunnelby, Venipede, and Bellsprout in a bit of an open area, which is really strange for a number of reasons. Starting with Bunnelby, it is a bit of a cowardly Pokemon. They're rabbits and will nom on plants, flowers, roots, you name it, but they aren't the type to actually attack other Pokemon, even if they can be a bit aggressive with us within this game, because when they do perceive a threat to their livelihood, such as a large bird, it is stated that they'll dig straight underground in order to hide. Lo and behold, we have a very gluttonous Bellsprout and an incredibly aggressive Venipede to worry about. In the case of Bellsprout, they will often just wrap themselves around whatever moves near them and find a way to turn it into their next meal. They are not restricted to insect Pokemon, though they also need to root themselves into the ground to absorb water, making them an easier target, especially if they get so comfy that they tend to forget that they need to actually run away, or are even unable to run away until they uproot themselves, which is a bit of a process. This then may result in the Bunnelby mistaking these Bellsprout for your average plant and trying to eat them then. And with the new commotion, as one fights the other, they realize that it's a living thing and not just a random plant. They then attract a Venipede in their conflict, in their squabble, thus giving us a reason as to why there is a fixed Alpha Bellsprout here, because of the pressure from these two Pokemon, if not at the very least Venipede, who will actively be incredibly aggressive in any lore whatsoever. In fact, at least within Legends ZA, the entirety of the Venipede line is stated to be incredibly aggressive, even if Whirlipede is noted to not always be that way in other games or its Pokedex entries. Venipede will actively look at something, and if it thinks it even has a chance of defeating it in battle, it will strike out to kill and eat whatever it was looking at, which often results in it attacking a number of creatures that it probably shouldn't. Though, despite being a bug Pokemon, it is noted to be able to have strong enough poisons to be able to paralyze large bird Pokemon, so it can handle itself pretty well. This behavior then explains why we primarily see Pidgey perched above the ground or even flying above the rooftops in this area. And it is here that we actually have two different sections of rooftops that tell us even more of an ecology story. In one section, we have Pidgey and Abra. The Abra are vibing, living out their days, eating a berry and sleeping the day away. They're not affecting much, as if they ever feel threatened, they'll just teleport farther away. They're pretty non-contender within the ecosystem. Meanwhile, on the other side of the rooftops, we start to find Pidgeotto here. And something I've stated in my previous ecology videos is that when we see an evolution of a Pokemon, we need to think about what caused it. We need to figure that out. And evolution is typically caused by pressure or an abundance of resources. Pressure could be from a predator species attacking the Pokemon often, or it could be two Pokemon that are fighting over resources such as food or territory, even mates if you would. Meanwhile, if there are an abundance of resources, we could also expect a higher population of a Pokemon and then find that it is evolving due to sheer amount of time and general life experience rather than immediate pressure by threats. For example, there is a section within Sinnoh in which you will not just find Bidoof, but because the route itself describes itself as having a ton of trees, a ton of wood, and access of it even, that you will also find Bibarel there. Now, at least in this case, within ZA, within Lumiose City, the Pidgeotto exists due to a very clear threat within the area, because not only will we find a section with tons of Venipede led by a fixed Alpha Whirlipede, but we will also find Electrike in the area, these electric wolves that make their way up the buildings. In fact, the Alpha Whirlipede might even exist because of the Pidgeotto, and then the Pidgeotto exists because of Electrike preying upon the Pidgey here. In addition, a common theme we'll find is that electric Pokemon often find their way up the buildings within Lumiose. This could be because of the food that they hunt, it could be because they can draw electricity from the buildings, or even due to them having a higher chance of lightning striking them by being up high. It could also just be a combination of all those reasons, not just one singular reason. And in the case of Electrike, I would say it's because it is hunting our birds, and because it can tell when a storm is coming, as it not only uses friction from the atmosphere as it runs to generate electricity, but also its body will begin to give off sparks if a storm is approaching. That's pretty horrifyingly dangerous if you wanted that as a pet, but also it is a wolf less than it is an actual dog, so I'm not really sure how this Pokemon would even work as a pet. Either way, it's causing a lot of trouble for the bird population here, and it's hunting them down, and that's why we have to have the Pidgeotto. Now, as for that Whirlipede, just as any other mid-stage cocoon Pokemon, it is just biding its time before it can evolve, though this one is at least more dangerous and active considering it has the capacity to roll at 60 miles per hour and then slam into whatever it deems unworthy to exist within its domain, stabbing them with those big ol' spikes that it has. All this allows it to protect the other Venipede in the area from the Pidgeot threat that is here. The last Pokemon of note is one that we've already talked about, being Binacle, though Cerebi and Bulbapedia state that they're supposed to spawn there. The game doesn't, show them, and I haven't ever seen them in this wild zone whatsoever. Like, the game doesn't say that they spawn there, at least by looking at the wild zone directly, but I suppose it would make sense for them to be within the section or any section of water that you can take that leads up to where the Venipede, Whirlipede, and those Pidgeotto are, as that water does move towards the sewers, and it would be a fantastic place for these Binacle to pick up any of the microorganisms, any plankton, you name it, from the water. And now that I've mentioned it, let's head on to our next destination, being the sewers of Lumiose. We'll begin with the main section of the sewers, and before you even get into the sewers, one of the Pokemon that makes habitat within them may actually greet you near the entrance as an Ariados hangs from the top of the tunnel. Ariados are pretty spooky Pokemon all in all. They're intelligent, can use you as a tracker to help it reach the rest of your family so it can have a buffet to eat rather than just eating you on the spot once it catches you, and they like to eat their food at their own leisure. No scarfing down your meals with this crazy guy. And in fact, once you enter the sewers, you likely won't find them unless you go through the canal access to a smaller section of the sewers. There is where you will find a large room where a group of them make their nest together. A nightmare scenario for any Pokemon that would be seen as prey by this massive spider, and trust me, every non-plant is on that meal list, which is funny to say because the only other Pokemon I saw in the same room with it is Skrelp, a Pokemon that is very much reminiscent of decaying seaweed. And as a side note, I actually got to find one of Mega Dragalge's inspirations personally when visiting a Florida beach, which is the little Sargassum here, who have these similar long blades that kind of look like the rotting and orbs that we would find on our Mega Pokemon. And yes, I was a big nerd, and I was by the water without my phone, saw it, ran all the way across the beach, grabbed my phone, ran all the way back, took a picture after, excitedly exclaiming it to my family, and then I ran all the way back again, dropped my phone off, and then ran into the water. I just couldn't resist. What do you want from me? But back on track, Skrelp are found in the entirety of the sewers and are actually incredibly friendly. Some Pokemon will run away. Otherwise, they might run around you and still kind of stay relatively nearby. Some might attack, and some just stare at you and don't really do much whatsoever. But Skrelp will just sit right in front of you and smile at you, and it's just so incredibly adorable. And it's not the only Pokemon to do that, but it was just nice while doing all this research to run into one Pokemon that wasn't running away from me or immediately trying to kill me. Their existence here may actually be by accident, considering that they are known to be poor swimmers that are washed away by storms, meaning that if they got caught up in the canal, they could be getting washed into these sewers by pure coincidence, though this isn't much of an issue for it, as it has less enemies here, and with its main source of food being rotten seaweed, it may also be finding other forms of detritus to consume. And you know what? I realize I have no idea how real-life seahorses actually even eat. Seahorses, not seahorse. That sounds... you know what? We're going to move on. According to American Oceans, in order to thrive in their underwater habitats, seahorses have developed special feeding adaptations to consume the food sources available to them. As they lack teeth, these captivating marine animals rely on their ability to suck in and swallow their prey whole. Which this may sound peculiar, it does allow seahorses to feed effectively on small organisms such as plankton, tiny crustaceans like copepods and shrimps, and even small fish. Also, that article describes that these seahorses will eat about 30 to 50 times a day, and it is through their constant ingestion of small prey that they can maintain their energy levels. Kind of reminds me of how hummingbirds function. So that would make it a little bit strange to see that Skrelp would only eat detritus, especially as we do have Dragalge here as well, who may appear alongside them in the main sewers where there's enough space for them. And Dragalge, by effect, is incredibly territorial, spitting poison at anyone who dares to trespass upon its territory, and with poison strong enough to melt the hulls of metal tankers, goodbye Titanic, I think it's safe to say that staying far, far away from anywhere it calls home is in your best interests. Now, with them, these Dragalge are specifically noted to be able to hunt from within seaweed in which they blend in with. Though here in Lumiose, it seems like the best way for them to blend in with its body that looks like it's decaying is to be near the dilapidated walls or be in that murky sewer water, even if it doesn't look murky to us on the surface. And while it is stated to feed on fish Pokemon such as Finizen,
yes, the fish Pokemon, Finizen. That totally isn't a mammal.
Dragalge once again seems like it may be foregoing its typical diet, as a number of other Pokemon kinda seem to within this city, and instead may find itself feeding upon some of our other common residents that we find here, alongside any other detritus that does appear through the sewers. Now, I will say it is actually a little bit harder to pinpoint what Pokemon Dragalge may be feasting on here, though I will at least note once again that even though we don't see any Magikarp within the sewers, we know that Magikarp are found throughout the waterways of the city as a whole. All it takes is for a Dragalge to make their way out of this area for a moment, get the sunlight it needs to build up its draconic power, and then eat a few fish before returning back home. Though, if it wants an easier meal, you can argue that it has a bit of a buffet to work with, as not only are there Inkay within these sewers, which is who I bet would be the primary target, but there are also Scraggy, Noibat, Patrat, and Goomy. Patrat is just being a security guard, as it has been in every other area we've seen it in, though at least within the sewers, we get Scraggy as our punk, hiding away in the cracks and crevices of society to make its home base. Funny enough, despite everything I've dug through and how abrasive this Pokemon can be since it wants to fight all the time, I have never been able to prove that it actually eats other Pokemon. If anything, I've proven that it just scavenges for seeds and anything else within places like the Desert Resort where we first see it. It actually, well, within Unova, of course. Now, it has a few different lizards that it is inspired by, one being the leopard gecko, considering how Scrafty's Mega looks like one after it sheds, though instead of eating its fill of bugs, as you would expect, it just never seems to do so. It never causes any pressure on other Pokemon, and the closest we could get to saying it has an effect on is Skrelp, though even then I doubt it's eating Skrelp. In fact, despite this being their habitat, they may very well be no different than the Noibat that we find here. In other words, Scraggy, Noibat, and many of our other Pokemon enjoy being in these sewers because it is actually warm here. At least by comparison to the outside world, we're not talking about it being like the tropics, the Bahamas within the sewers. No. You see, when I saw that there were a number of these Pokemon here, I started to question how in the world they were surviving. Why would they even choose a place like this? Isn't it cold? There's really not all that much food. They aren't putting that much pressure on each other unless they're being territorial. So the only possibility is that these sewers gave them an environmental benefit, being warmth and, by extension, space. There's a lot of different rooms that they can hide away in. So even as far back as 2011, there were plans for Paris to fuel 30% of its energy needs by 2020, and one of the new heating projects to help them achieve this was to have a school use power from the sewers, where the temperatures average between 12 to 20 degrees Celsius or 53 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. For our Pokemon, this would be far better than the colder weather you might experience outside in certain times of the year. You know, freezing when it snows. What's also fun, I realize, is that the sewers of Paris are very popular overall, and you can even make a reservation to go visit them, allowing you to go through tight tunnels and abandoned rooms to experience the vastness of it. So, I suppose I can forgive Pokemon for not having the catacombs of Paris, as I was ignorant to how significant these sewers actually are. Back to the world of Pokemon, though, and specifically Scraggy, it will likely wander around and seek food outside of here, though at least both Noibat and Inkay have the option to chow down on their choice of Pokemon here as a bit of fast food if they don't want to leave. Inkay will work to hypnotize their prey, confusing them with their array of colors before striking. But with our cephalopod preferring fish, crustaceans, and microorganisms amongst other options, it seems as though Scraggy is still safe from another threat, assuming that Inkay is following that diet of the real-life animal. In fact, these waterways make it so that our Pokemon just have to find a nice, safe space for themselves and wait for the food to arrive through the sewers. After all the water has to come through here, right? Now, Noibat might actually eat a few Scraggy if they can manage it. There are species of bat that will eat lizards after all, and while a little bit rubbery, they are still lizards under all of their rubber pants. That sentence got really weird. I realize, and I'm sorry, but they are luckily just not part of Noibert's. Luckily, Scraggy are just not part of Noibat's regular diet, so they don't have much to worry about. Honestly, the most antagonistic Pokemon stay away from each other by separating into the main and canal access portions, these Pokemon being the aforementioned Ariados and Dragalge, though neither feeds on the other and they're just being very territorial. A Pokemon having a field day within the sewers and likely leading to the eventual collapse of the sewer systems of Lumiose as a whole, in my personal opinion, is Klefki. I say this because you might think that it just collects keys and absorbs their metallic ions, when in fact they only do this because humanity mined up all the iron deposits that they love most. In other words, Klefki were originally a cave-dwelling species that adapted to live in abandoned hotels and places such as these sewers, where it can absorb the metallic ions from whatever it desires. And while keys are still their go-to, I guarantee that it won't be long before they start drawing ions from the pipes themselves. Now, I won't go super crazy with this, but this is something I was learning personally for when I originally wanted to be an environmental engineer. Now, iron is fantastic, it's strong, it's stable, and if you really want to, you can make it even better. When we look at sewer water, a lot of stuff is being flushed through it. This could be everything that you are allowed to go through. Fecal matter, urine, some level of safe chemicals that you can flush down the toilet depending upon whatever it says on the bottle. But then it could also be the many hundreds of thousands of other things that should not be flushed down the toilet. Harsh acidic chemicals, strong bases, medication, babies, goldfish babies, and other large physical objects such as mattresses. Don't ask me about that last one. I toured a water facility plant in college, and a mattress was one of the things that somehow got into their system. Luckily, there are multiple levels to help with all of this trash. For simplicity, there are catchers to get the big stuff, catchers for the small stuff, and a bunch of neutralization processes that they use. Though, in order to even get to the point of being neutralized, the sewer water described as black water has to first arrive at the designated facility, meaning that these pipes have to be able to withstand whatever extreme types of chemical junk that might be going through them. Now, in order to do this, you have your strong, unreactive metal, but then you also line it with other materials such as an epoxy or cement, things that can help prevent leaks or electrochemical corrosion while maintaining stability and allowing them to last longer. There's definitely more to this, but I'll spare you all the extra nitty-gritty details, because the purpose of even mentioning all of these details is to say that once Klefki starts removing ions from these pipes, all it takes is for one bad chemical reaction and the rest of these pipes will start falling apart in a flash. So hopefully the Klefki are being well fed. Our last Pokemon are only found in the main sewers, one of which being Gumi, who is living their best life as long as nobody else decides to cross the water to go get it. Gumi is unfortunately the weakest dragon Pokemon in existence. Not my words, Pokemon themselves. And these Pokemon may very well be just one of the weakest Pokemon overall. It is a happy and gentle creature that really just wants to eat leaves and move on with its day. Though here in the sewers, it might be eating whatever comes to it without any complaints. After all, snails kind of really weirdly have a massive array of varied diets in the world. Some of them are omnivores, some of them are carnivores. They eat leaf, they eat decaying matter if they're a detrivore. Maybe they don't eat at all because they're the scaly-foot gastropod, which has bacteria within its body that just takes care of all the processes inside of it whatsoever, and they don't need to eat at all, which is a very confusing thing that I should really read up more on my personal time at some point. Nevertheless, Gumi is all to itself, or at least trying to be, and what's adorable is that I never realized that I could change the music while using the camera until Muse Art World let me know midstream, and then I was able to watch this little Gumi bob and dance, smiling all happily at me. They'll also appear outside of the sewers when it rains, with Sliggoo also being noted as a potential encounter out there, but as a rare encounter. Now, hopefully in these sewers, it's left alone because the only Pokemon that might actually attack it would be one of these last three: Litwick, Ghastly, and Haunter. With Litwick, it's arguably not going to actually kill anything. Doing so would put it at a higher risk of not getting what it wants. Think like how the passenger pigeon was wiped out by Americans for food or accessories, and then there were none left to reproduce, meaning that there were no more goods or food to have had from a pigeon that doesn't exist anymore. It's like a farmer saying, oh, if I just, slaughter all of my beef cattle, I'll just sell more next year, even though they literally have no more beef cattle because they slaughtered them all. Oops. Now, it actually benefits Litwick to take only the amount of life energy necessary to get it to evolve. And I've talked about this in my last video, so I'll keep it shorter here, but life energy is not your spirit energy. It is effectively your body's natural reservoir of energy that it can refill. meaning that at least Litwick won't kill you, or it might not kill you. The Lampent will take your soul when you die, and Chandelure won't even bother to wait until you're dead. It is burning your soul up on the spot. This just means, though, that Litwick will just be taking advantage of any lost or wandering people and Pokemon for any of its necessary fuel for its flame, though the same cannot be said for Ghastly and Haunter, who are here. For as much as this is my favorite Pokemon line, as evidenced by the freaking shrine behind me, they are deadly, even more so once they evolve. And then, when I was scouting out the area, an Alpha Haunter appeared that was absolutely out for my blood no matter how far I was running away. It was seeing through the walls, and you can't tell me otherwise. Assuming that it chooses anything as prey, it's going to stalk their victim while also beckoning them to come closer with those floaty hands that Haunter has. And with one lick of its tongue, the prey will be left convulsing on the floor until their death. And there's no escape from them, as they can just float through walls. And to make matters worse, at least in the anime, it can control any Pokemon it touches with its hands, meaning it can use another Pokemon as a bait, as lure for more food. But one detail about Haunter has me very, very curious regarding these sewers as a whole. Because through the main story, we have to go through an illusory wall that was created by Gwyn's Chandelure. In addition, we have Inkay, who is a psychic type, a typing often associated with illusions, and then Haunter, who is adept at creating illusions as well. And with Gwyn meeting Litwick here when they were younger, and continuing to use this place as a getaway from Ivor, it makes me wonder if they built up a negative or ghostly energy within these sewers, which eventually attracted more of the ghost Pokemon that we see here. Of course, there are still Mega Crystals that have to get cleaned out from time to time, as we learn from Corbo's missions, lest they block the pipes, so that's definitely a part of this as well in terms of attracting Pokemon into the sewers. In fact, obstructing the pipes would also harm not only the city's infrastructure, but also the Pokemon, making a massive issue for the cycle of ecology here. Long story short, these sewers are far more important across the board than they seem on the surface, which was an unexpected but very pleasant surprise. Whether you're looking at the ghost types that are attracted here, the psychic type, which is Inkay as I stated, or how any of these Pokemon may interact with each other or make this a habitat in which they sleep in and then leave to go hunting. Zone 6 explains itself as having multiple heights to explore, from the rooftops down to the canal, and in said canal, there are plenty of Binacle filter feeding as the water rushes past them, in addition to a fixed Alpha Binacle, which I at least saw closest to where the water does come out. This would then give us our other example of why we would have an evolved or Alpha Pokemon, because there is an excess of food or resources for it, and whatever food it doesn't consume, the resident Magikarp that are actually in the canal, more down the stream, can get their bottom feeding on. Though I'm sure our canal Pokemon have to deal with a Houndour within this area from time to time. In fact, the Houndour and the fixed Alpha Houndoom really seem to control the main street here, like a couple of greased up gangsters snapping their fingers down the alleyways and coming after not only us, but the Pokemon that reside here. Now, no other Pokemon gets anywhere near them, and the second you walk in and they notice you, you are being mobbed by this pack of dogs. With Houndour being a canine, it's just gonna eat whatever it can sink its teeth into. They are already very intelligent and have incredible teamwork unseen in most other Pokemon, going as far as to not abandon the sick and communicating through various barks and howls. This is all noted by the Pokedex information. I know there are plenty of other very intelligent Pokemon, so, bear with me. Now, the howls are also used to declare ownership over territory, in which, of course, they are very protective over, and so that is why we might often see them howling before they run after us, making clear sense now as to why we also see no other Pokemon on the streets of the Wild Zone. Any Pokemon that do decide to come down are only going to serve as a potential meal. This becomes even worse for any prey in the area with that Alpha Houndoom I mentioned. It is an even more powerful leader, having been selected to lead due to being the strongest of its pack, which is a little funny considering it is a literal alpha. And speaking of funny things, the funny thing to me is that alphas aren't really a thing in the wild. Social hierarchy does exist in some animals, but that doesn't mean that they are actually the most aggressive or dominant. Instead, it could be an older but healthier animal, able to lead and help care for the younger and the elderly, which may surprise you is a thing in a number of different species. For example, we talked about meerkats earlier. Meerkats will actively decide to break the tails of scorpions to then give to the young and the elderly who don't quite know how to hunt yet or are no longer able to hunt, helping care for the rest of their species. For goodness knows, basically no benefit to their group or pack, whatever you want to call it, whatsoever. It's a beautiful thing. Now, the closest you can get to alpha is through lions and gorillas, but then again, the males aren't really in charge for lions, as we discussed earlier, and the gorilla is more about making loud sounds and running up to any other gorillas, trying to mack on their boo and then try to take them away instead of actually fighting. It just takes too much effort to genuinely fight another creature. It's a waste of energy, and you're already spending so many hours eating leaf. Why waste that energy, right? So long story short, anyone who seriously considers themselves as an alpha in, humans, pretty cringe at the end of the day. Despite all that though, alphas of course technically exist within Pokemon, though only because of an excess amount of energy has filled their bodies and they've grown dramatically in size and power while becoming very, very aggressive, which is kind of a big deal considering Houndoom is already a scary Pokemon. Fire and poison mixed together to burn a foe in ways that will never heal makes it so that as long as Houndoom can get a little bit of burning in, it's only a matter of time before its prey will collapse due to an infection-induced fever. Yeah, that's kind of a big deal. I didn't think about it until I was writing the script, but the fact that the wounds never heal mean that you are constantly bleeding, or it's constantly an irritant, or you have an open wound that bacteria can get into, resulting in you getting an infection. This is horrifying to consider, which would then also explain why we would then find the Baneri in this area are only found across the bridge, trying to stay far away from the trouble. In fact, remember what I said about Pokemon making their way in and out of wild zones? I can safely state that these Baneri wander in from time to time from the nearby park, and they could just leave if they truly wanted to. In fact, while it was obviously not supposed to happen, one dug its way out and nearly bopped me. Honestly, Baneri's presence here makes no sense to me otherwise if we don't assume that it's just visiting this small place as it pleases to make a small nest or habitat for itself. There's no food source, it puts itself at risk if it runs across the bridge, and it's just otherwise stuck to this tiny little area. It's a pretty dumb spot for it to be unless it just uses it as a miniature nest for itself and it runs to the parks nearby. That this is just a small area for it to escape to stay away from humans, to stay away from Pokemon, to stay away from the busyness of the big city. And Cerebi does state that they generally spawn in the vert sector, so it's plausible that this is the idea. The only other Pokemon on the ground floor is actually within the battle court during the daytime only. Here, the Meditite train, likely only battling against each other, soaking up the sun to improve their psychic abilities because they have, the third eye, the mind's eye, and eating that singular berry every single day. Apparently, what is interesting is that they actually can't eat more than that singular berry. They will become sick if they do, which I had originally thought was just part of their training, not an important part of their biology that they had to abide by, and I only found that out thanks to a random side mission that I accidentally completed while trying to get footage on stream. It's also hard to say if they're interacting with the Houndour and the Houndoom, but I'm willing to bet there's clashes from time to time, and the Meditite just decide to close the door on them and watch them bark and howl through the gate, assuming they don't actually decide to try and fight them as part of their own training. This would also have to mean that in order for the Meditite to get in and out of here, they're either floating away or they're running through the area overall, because there are not really any good places, easy places for them to get their one berry a day. As we move up the buildings, there's actually a third fixed alpha, being the only Pikachu that you'll find in this zone just sitting on top of a roof by itself. Once again, pretty clear to understand that electric Pokemon are seeking habitats on higher ground in order to get struck by lightning, though I think this is another case in which a Pokemon may have found itself in a bad situation, much like that fletchling in the earlier Wild Zone, and had to now grow stronger in order to survive here and try to escape. On the main climb up, the other electric type we will run into is Flaffy. Same reasoning as Pikachu, though instead of becoming an alpha, it evolved. So these Houndour, to try and explain all this better, the Houndour and Houndoom are causing problems, and there may have been a population of Pikachu or Pichu and Mareep here, just like we see in Wild Zone 1 with Mareep and Pichu. Then the dogs moved in, and they had to retreat. Unfortunately, if there was a Pichu or Pikachu population, they were effectively wiped out here. As for the Mareep, they were forced to evolve to survive, and now that they can stand on their hind legs, they were able to climb up to the roof easier. Though there is that one shiny Mareep that appears on the roof of Zone 1 as part of a side quest, so believe what you will, the Flaffy still exists because of the canine threat here at the very least. Even higher than this, at the very highest point of this Wild Zone, we find Swablu. They find a safe nest up here for themselves and are right by these vents, which likely provide them some cozy warmth from the buildings they're on. They're friendly and calm Pokemon, their round beaks telling us that they're seed eaters, and they enjoy being near towns in the spring and staying in clean areas where they can be sure that their puffy feathers can stay pristine. Not to say they don't like bathing, in fact they love baths. It's their plumage that doesn't, as they lose all of their volume in the process. What I enjoy is that within Pokemon Snap, Swablu, primarily Altaria really, are shown to bathe in the natural caldera of the volcano, the heat probably ensuring that the volume of their feathering is retained and they don't become this weird little squishy, I don't know how to describe it, I'm just going to show you. This won't be the last time that we see Swablu on a rooftop this high, as there's another zone that has a very, very high perch, not just for it, but for another Pokemon that takes to the skies and needs a place of refuge from the dangers of this world. Moving on to Wild Zone 7, I will openly state that this is the first zone in which I got absolutely mobbed by the Pokemon. They are an absolute threat here and are incredibly aggressive. Though, before we talk about the ecology, there's an Obelisk that we find here that bothers me because we know so little about it. Though it is only one of two in this game, when there were originally 5 total within the original X and Y games. In addition to this, the Pokemon linguists and cipher solvers are trying to figure out what the heck the bottom portion could mean, and it's semi-conclusive so far. One thing that is agreed upon is actually something I would not have been able to solve without an individual known as Platinum Ox, who showed that these symbols on this obelisk match Rayquaza. I'd suspected it had something to do with the legendary Pokemon, but I hadn't put together that these symbols really are 1-to-1. All while these obelisks have a perfectly clear view of Prism Tower, making them seem so much more important than they're played out to be within the games. Watch as there's like the other 3 within hyperspace Lumiose. That'd be absurd, and we have to like find them to create anchors so that way we can save Lumiose as a whole. That would, you know what, that might actually work. I want to hope, though, that we will get some sort of defined answer as to what's going on here, but the best we have is that these were brought in from Hoenn, most likely, and we just don't know the complete purpose of them just yet. I would share the speculations that I did discuss with others, but I would like to save that for a future video, and I would need to talk with them a little bit further. Instead, I will draw your attention to the Pokemon on top of the obelisk, the fixed Alpha Fletchender that is an incredible antagonist within this area. And it's not as though it has any real predators here. No, in fact, there's an abundance of important infinite resources here. This whole area is blessed by an incredible amount of sunlight, as evidenced by the terrain and a number of the other Pokemon that we will discuss here. So, knowing this, and that in the real world that robins are typically seen as the first sign of spring's arrival and warmth, all of this extra warmth and sunlight has supercharged Fletchling to evolve into Fletchender and become an alpha Pokemon that watches over this zone. It is stated that they do hunt for prey, but that would likely be done outside of this zone, as there aren't any Pokemon it would see as typical prey. In addition, it's kind of a really stupid idea for if you're hunting prey to be seen so perfectly out in the open, so there's no way it's hunting any of the Pokemon here. In fact, with it being so protective of its territory, it may even be protecting the other Pokemon here, further explaining why nearly every single other creature in the zone is so ridiculously aggressive. To this effect, because of all the direct sunlight, it has become a good home for Hippopotas, who spends its time bathing in sand and avoiding water at all costs. This, of course, becomes easy when there's such a large section of pure sand here. Just nice, dry sand that gets in between your toes. I'm sure everyone loves it, which does mimic the desert life for it. This sand is vital not just for when it searches for prey, but also for protecting itself from germs, or even cooling off as it expels sand from its body instead of sweat. They swallow plenty of sand alongside their prey, though what could that prey be? Because hippos in real life may mess up a crocodile or literally any other creature stupid enough to enter their territory, but they aren't typically eating any of these animals. No, typically they would be eating leaves, roots, ferns. And when we look at other games, such as Pokemon Snap, we find that its evolution, Hippowdon, can be found inside a watery oasis, living peacefully amongst other Pokemon, which is not always the case within that game. I have a full ecology of that game as well, with tons of beautiful visuals, so you can make sure to check that out after this, if you so wish. Nevertheless, it does have a symbiotic relationship with other Pokemon that can help with removing any rock blockages from the vents on its body, meaning that this line of Pokemon isn't going to be horribly aggressive to everything. What would make the most sense then is that Hippopotas would be an omnivore. After all, it still does have those strong molars, best fit for grinding down fibrous material, and there are tons of roots growing around here, which are thanks to our other Pokemon that we find here. In other words, we may find that because of Floette and Roselia, there are plenty of roots for Hippopotas to feed on, which is actually kind of cute to imagine that these Pokemon are actively growing more of these thorny roots in the area just to help feed our little hippo. Because not only does our hippo get fed by them, assumedly, but because of the overturning of soil that it completes while it digs, it ensures that the ground is properly aerated for Roselia at the least, primarily if it does decide to dig into the dirt. After all, many of our plant Pokemon still rely on the soil, as we know with Bellsprout and I'm sure Roselia as well. Soil needs to have a proper balance of air, water, organic matter, and inorganic matter. It'll all just depend on the type of plant, of course, as to what that balance is. Though, no matter what, if the soil is too compact, then air, water, and nutrients, technically, can't make their way to our plant's roots, or the roots can't break through all this compacted soil, making Hippopotas' existence here just as vital for Roselia as Roselia would then be vital for Hippopotas and making sure it doesn't try to eat all the other Pokemon here. Now, Roselia is fairly docile. In fact, you're allowed to smell its roses, as long as you don't try to take them, pluck them from its body. Something that is very interesting to note is that many Pokemon that evolve via an evolution stone may not actually need that evolution stone. The stones are sometimes just a shortcut to their evolution, and one of these cases would theoretically be with Roselia, as with enough strong sunlight, it will be able to, assumedly, evolve into Roserade. This is why you can find them in the wild within some regions, and even if it doesn't evolve, this is just a healthy place for Roselia to live with all the sunlight here. Plus, there has to be a good amount of water below the surface, or else we wouldn't have the greenery that we do have here. As for the Floette that we do find here, being both the red and orange flowered carriers, they fully become attached to their flowers in terms of how they cycle their energy. They provide energy to not only the flower that they carry, but also to flower beds throughout this city. They even go as far as celebrating when there are blooms of flowers, all because they can draw an incredible amount of their power from them and use them for defending themselves and nature as a whole. And assuming that power never needs to be used, then the Floette will simply continue to care for nature and help it flourish. I may even go as far as saying there's a chance that the Floette here understand that there is an excess amount of energy, and despite there being Pokemon that might destroy the roots, they never destroy the flowers that we find here, meaning that Floette will likely never come into conflict or start any fights with any of the other denizens of this zone for stomping on a flower or two. Instead, it understands what is necessary to help the area grow and flourish. One Pokemon that is supposed to appear at all times is Audino, though I have never really had any luck finding it whatsoever. It then makes me wonder if it is anything similar to our Starmie event that affects Zone 16, or if I just have horrible, god-awful, terrible luck. Now, Audino is kind of a solid fit here. There are plenty of Pokemon cooperating with each other, meaning that it would be able to avoid conflict as it is apt to do. I mean, if it even hears any amount of conflict whatsoever, it just dashes out of there in a snap. It can also feel all of the positive, healthy energy that exists here, likely thanks to Floette. And then there's other, or at least one other thematic piece that we find, as there are ice cream carts within this zone. These very carts are the typical spawning point of where we will find Vanillite. Now you might be confused as to what's going on with Vanilla and why is this ice cream cone in an area where there's so much sunlight if we know for a fact it will die if it melts. Well, that's because it knows that the best way for it to grow is by melting a little bit with the rise of the sun and then hiding away in the ice cream cart to let the water freeze again. Being someone who lives in Wisconsin, I cannot express to you the sheer size of icicles that I see on my home on one side of my house throughout the winter, because the sun rises on that side, melts the snow and ice, which then drips down, and as the sun eventually sets on the other side, and everything starts to get colder again, everything starts to freeze again, once the sun is no longer directly beaming on it, it will all eventually just freeze again and become longer overall thanks to this process. The icicles become over 5 feet long, and I become ever so slightly scared of them not only hitting my windows when I knock them down, but also maybe them hitting me, or more importantly, in my eyes, I could take a hit, probably not from my icicle, I fear them hitting my fiance. And let me tell you right now, one of these icicles did hit me, as it bounced off the ground and hit me in the crotch. I was not happy with that, I did not need medical attention, and it did hurt quite a bit, but I was okay. But hey, on the plus side, Jaeger was super happy. He loves the snow and loves icicles, so the winter is like the best time for him. Tangent aside, Vanillite even states that it is theoretically born from icicles bathed in energy from the morning sun, and it sleeps buried within the snow. These aren't actual pieces of ice cream, they're just icicles with some extra fluff on top, and have actually been noted to have inspired humanity's creation of ice cream. Funnily enough, everything then comes full circle, as it lives in this zone, and I would love to imagine that it sleeps within these ice cream carts, or even hides within them on hotter days within Kalos. Otherwise, it's just vibing here without a care in the world. Somehow I managed to not talk about a few Pokemon before editing, so here I am in voiceover only. There's Kakuna, who just vibes here, and then Ghastly and Shuppet, who both only appear here at night. These are definitely more thematic, I would say, as Ghastly doesn't want to be out here in the open with a lot of wind, and there aren't any other incredibly negative Pokemon for Shuppet to feed on, so Ghastly's probably just passing through. After all, Shuppet does feed, though, upon negative emotions of others, and the only thing I want to make a claim that it feeds on is some sort of latent negative energy from the Obelisk that we find here. I say this because the other Obelisk has a tie to space, with Starmie landing there in a side mission, thus tying together a classic connection between space and the afterlife, though this may need some additional investigating to really bring it together properly. From a zone that feels as though everyone is working together, to a zone where it feels like only the strongest and fastest will survive, we're in the zone where I actually got what is now my Alpha Crocodile, Florida Man. A very fitting name for the crocodile that absolutely wrecked my team as I was trying to catch it in the first place. Now, this place has 2 fixed alphas that are likely very aggressive with each other, one being an Alpha Crocorock, the other one being an Alpha Camerupt, and this zone is also the closest to Jean Sector 3 where the Mega Camerupt had appeared. Now, to better help understand this area of sand, we actually need to begin with Numel and Sandile, because in the case of Sandile, they are an ambush predator, swimming through the sand in order to catch anything made of meat. In fact, the entire line are ambush predators, but the difference here is that as it evolves, it becomes stronger. That and Crocodile doesn't have a habitat, and even if it did, it doesn't have a Flygon to team up with. Lucky us and every other Pokemon in existence, as it will decide to probably escape at some point and destroy any cars by biting them into nothingness. That'd be a really huge issue. Now, Sandile itself is like any other reptile, needing plenty of sun to keep it warm and happy. In addition, they work together, keeping others of its kind safe from any sort of threats, and technically, there are very few real threats here. The Machop here, though, they don't serve as any threat whatsoever. They are here as a form of training, as they often are, same as they would be in any other location, really. Though, they may also be serving to ensure that the population of Sandile and Krokorok doesn't get out of hand. Oh, well, I'm sure they're eating their fill of food from the fruit stand that is in this area that nobody decided to remove before all these Pokemon took over, or after, for that matter. After all, most of our pure fighting-type Pokemon seem to not eat meat or hunt other Pokemon at all. Meanwhile, any of our dual-type fighting Pokemon still hunt or still actively attack. I'm looking at Pokemon such as Grapploct or Lucario, who is noted to hunt in packs. The only other threat here is actually a rare one, which explains why we don't see its evolution, and we don't see any other Pokemon here evolving due to the pressure, as we have Gibble. Little adorable Gibble, waddling around in only the way its fat little body can and no other Pokemon can. I would absolutely love to take one home in an instant if I knew that it wouldn't try to nibble, or rather bite down on every little thing that comes near its mouth. They live in the holes found here in place of the holes and caverns it would dig and live in typically, as this is the best way for it to survive thanks to natural geothermal heat that keeps it warm even in the winter or cold environments. And to explain geothermal heat briefly, basically, core of the earth, constant reactions are technically happening, there's heat, there's pressure, things are moving around, and that heat has to escape somewhere. That heat is partially why our planet is warm alongside the sun and many other millions of different things that I am not going to talk about here, as I am oversimplifying this a lot still. And we're able to use that geothermal heat for our own processes, and in this case, at least within the Pokemon world, Gabite is making use of that geothermal heat somehow, which I guess would theoretically mean that it's able to feel where that heat's coming from and find the best places in which that heat arises, so that way it can dig, create a habitat for itself underground, and allow that heat to keep it warm when it gets cold. They're also known to be Pokemon that huddle together, play fight with each other, and then of course use their strong jaws to bite into their prey and drag them kicking and screaming into their nest. And this is when we begin to see how our Pokemon are affecting each other. Gibble and Sandile are strong predators, do not mistake that. Though they will absolutely not just attack each other, but every other Pokemon in the area, including our last two entries who are Drillbur and Numel. Now, Drillbur is slightly more complicated than you would expect, because moles in the real world are going to destroy crops while hunting down insects or worms. They aerate that soil real good, but make things look real ugly, which is why people for the longest time thought that moles were eating their crops when the crops were just a hurdle to crash through in order to reach a juicy limb. The hard part with Drillbur is that I have seen it in so many different locations, yet have hardly seen insects in the same place. Even when they are in the same area, it seems like there's almost no pressure put onto them. It's almost as if whatever they are eating is something we cannot see, and it is not above ground, which makes sense. Again, it's a mole. Of course, it's going to dig for its meal. As such, it is very likely that Drillbur is here doing some undercover work that we will never see. Underground work, if you would, as it helps keep the wild zone healthy. Unfortunately for it, though, it's still on the dinner plate for our very toothy Pokemon who have the capacity to dig. Though, the one who garners the most attention as it doesn't dig underground is easily Numel, very big Pokemon. Now, Numel are typically not aggressive, but if they miss mealtime, they will go on their own little rampage. Otherwise, they will stay very docile until something hits them really hard, because they're built like absolute units that don't notice wimpy little punches. Eventually, though, with enough conflicts between aggressive Sandile going after Numel, conflict would occur more and more between everyone. This wouldn't immediately result in Numel's evolution, but instead the Sandile would continue to eat and grow into Krokorok, this Pokemon being the highest level non-alpha in the area, and it now needs a lot more food in order to fill its stomach. They move in groups, they have amazing night vision, even though they don't really move around at night all that much, and will even work to bury their prey together. A real threat in this area, but that's the food chain for you. This results then in Numble being targeted a little too often, and with all the excess energy, all the anger, all the just irritation of almost being eaten all the time, it goes a half step beyond evolution and becomes an alpha Camerupt. Its anger and aggressiveness coming out even stronger than when it would be on an empty stomach. But here's the kicker. Camerupt is a necessary component of this area. That's why the alpha form is always found here, because its body contains that molten lava within it. The heat radiating from its body and the heat that is released when that mini volcano erupts out of anger is going to create a microclimate that keeps everyone within this wild zone very, very happy. Everyone except for Krokorok, who doesn't care and just really wants its next meal. So then the Krokorok and Camerupt duke it out until eventually Krokorok becomes an alpha. And this then becomes a cycle that creates a very unique desert-like ecosystem in the middle of France. In fact, now that I think about it, it kind of reminds me of the man-made crocodile exhibits that are in France, these being the only places where you can even see these and other reptiles. And at the end of the day, though, the Camerupt does have the highest level of all. Let's just hope it can hold out long enough in its battles with Krokorok to ensure the fire in this zone never dies out. And that actually might be why the Mega Camerupt appears. Because maybe enough conflicts ended up occurring, maybe that Camerupt was really close to being eaten, and that Alpha Camerupt, being the strongest here, kept absorbing more and more energy, the Mega energy naturally being guided to it, because when it came to these Mega Rogue fights, when it came to all of this, and when these Mega Rogue fights are actually resolved, what happens right after the battle? Energy coalesces together in the air, and then a Mega Stone is formed. It is almost as if the energy itself has an attraction to itself, that it wants to be denser. It wants to actually have a physical form. This is why we then see the crystals. This is why we then get these Mega Stones. And then this is why we have the higher chance of seeing certain Pokemon become Mega forms and how they're able to track it. Because all of that energy is becoming dense within one area, within one Pokemon primarily, then resulting in something that can be tracked and something that can be handled and predicted through Quizartico and through any means necessary in order to prevent disaster. It's also really weird to think about it then, because if it wasn't Mega Camerupt in that area, theoretically, you could even argue that Mega Crocodile could have happened. Wild. There may not be any caves to enter within Lumiose City if you don't count the sewers, but there is Wild Zone 9, which incidentally mimics cave habitats. This becomes incredibly evident when you look at the types of Pokemon found here, being Carbink, Sableye, and Mawile. Pokemon that are most exclusively found in or near caves, and the reason they are here is twofold. One, because of the scaffolding in the area, which creates the cave-like habitat, and two, because of the absolute massive amount of Mega Crystals that are here. I mean, this is arguably the #1 spot, if not one of the highest amassings of Mega Crystals within Lumiose, which is crazy to think about considering there isn't even a massive event that occurs here yet. I'm going to say yet. And of course, due to all of these crystals on top of everything else, this wild zone gets a little wild. So let's start with the Carbink, who are attracted to the crystals. They don't eat the crystals, they are just reminded of their natural home, the Crystal Kingdom, and come here. This is a common case with any Carbink, often amassing wherever there are huge clusters of any sort of crystal within any cave-like environment. Not that big of a deal. As such, there isn't a lot going on with them. They stick to each other, help each other stay shiny through polishing each other, which sounds incredibly dirty, and I'm sorry. And then they blast away any threats with their high energy beams, which are emitted from the crystals embedded within their body, which them keeping themselves well polished is probably incredibly necessary for them to fire stronger beams from their bodies. Though, unfortunately, despite all of this, they still have to face the threat that is their natural predator, Sableye. The Sableye are most often found at the base of the scaffolding on the ground floor, the areas where it feels the most like a cave. And of course, they are on the hunt for any carping who have drifted down from on top of the buildings here, waiting for their moment to eat any of the gems from their fairy bodies. Though I will also say, I don't believe there are any mega crystals on that ground floor area whatsoever, and that's probably due to the Sableye. But to help balance things out and ensure that these Carbink aren't wiped out, there is Mawile here. You'd expect her to be a Pokemon that would eat Carbink, but that isn't necessarily always the case. We at least see within Pokemon Snap that they can be friendly with one another, and Mawile may not even care for eating Carbink. Instead, the Mawile I commonly find is the one hiding behind a tree, taking full advantage of the new type of cover to attract unsuspecting prey towards it. The only prey on the ground being these Sableye that I've talked about. You see, Mawile is a reverse anglerfish. It shows its bright, kind of yellow, kind of brown body, which looks much like a vulnerable child just waiting to be eaten by a monster. And when these aggressive Pokemon such as Sableye come close, it uses its hair, mouth, maw to snap down on them. Mawile notes itself that it is a Pokemon that can eat using its normal mouth, but will use its hair maws to eat anything that it doesn't like the taste of. This could include more than just Sableye, so it's best to keep a safe distance from this Pokemon, and I'm really hoping it's not eating chunks of concrete or anything else from the buildings, the ground, or otherwise. It's arguably not an incredibly aggressive Pokemon towards other Pokemon. In addition, close to this wild zone is Magenta Sector 6, which is where the Mega Mawile had appeared. So a Mawile within this area may have found its way up to the rooftop and Mega evolved, as we see much later in the game. All it would need to do is then eat that amassing of Mega Crystals. Strangely enough, the crystals seem to be attracting Psychic Pokemon as well, since we have both Esper and Kadabra here. The latter of which is fairly easy to explain, as once again, Kadabra isn't really a Pokemon that typically does much ecosystem-wise. Yeah, sure, it emits alpha particles or alpha waves from its body, which is a little terrifying because, you know, those are waves of radiation. Though admittedly, those aren't even that big of a deal as long as you're not basically swallowing them accidentally, which you're probably doing if you're commanding Kadabra to do anything. Though, when we take into account that Esper is trying to improve its psychic abilities, we may begin to understand that Kadabra may serve to be a role model of sorts to it, a Pokemon that can help Esper gain control over its incredibly destructive powers, and in doing so, Esper is able to evolve with little stress, as it has plenty of hiding spaces in the event that it ever becomes scared. Though, we don't actually get to see a regular Meowstic here. Instead, we get to see fixed alphas, which, while Bulbapedia swears it's a male in the day and a female at night, I had a fixed male during the night and a fixed female during the day. Nevertheless, their presence here on the rooftop is very telling because there are plenty of Esper primarily up here, which might debunk my Kadabra Esper Master Pupil theory, but I'd still say it's a possibility, at least thematically. Nevertheless, we have Alpha Psychic Cats on the roof, and instead of seeing any fletchling, we only get to see Fletchinder here, making it very clear that our adorable little kitty cats are up here eating their fill of birds. And I will say, I can't quite pinpoint exactly when it happened, but Esper itself suddenly became one of my favorite psychic Pokemon and is probably my favorite cat Pokemon out of all of them. It's kind of like that one cat parasite that makes you have an absolute fascination with them. Can't explain when it happened, it just kind of happened. Also, take what I just said with a grain of salt, of course. That parasite is far more complicated than just that and is continually being studied. The only other Pokemon here is an Alpha Manectric on the rooftops. Once again, we find a Manectric to begin with because it likely was once an Electrike bounding across the rooftops in search of a meal and some lightning to occasionally hit it. It is a very strong and avid hunter. Though unfortunately for it messed with the wrong Esper a few too many times, and now Mommy and Daddy Alpha Meowsticks popped into existence. Though this had an adverse effect, as they are incredibly aggressive, being alphas, resulting in at least one Manectric to stick around and become an alpha in return. Despite all of this though, it is still a lower level than the Meowstic, and as such, I would like to believe that the reason we only see one of the Meowstic during any given time is because they are actively doing their best to protect their litter of Esper on these rooftops. To me, this makes the most sense and allows us to also explain why each of these Pokemon are here to begin with, and it also makes this zone pretty easy to understand and explain overall. It's a little war between the cats, the dogs, and overall survival. If you have thalassophobia, I feel bad for your son, because Zone 10 is a nightmare come to life for you. You may walk in and you might first see some Bellsprout wandering around and some very dopey, happy-looking Slowpoke. These adorable salamander hippo hybrid monsters are enjoying their time on land sometimes, and other times they will swim in the water, and it is also within this water that they fish for their fill of food. What fish are they hoping for? What fish are they hoping to catch? Well, that's a great question, because it is nothing but absolute terror within these waters, as the first Pokemon you will likely see in said water is going to be not only Carvanha, but also Sharpedo. And I don't know about you, but I have never seen a regular Sharpedo in this area, despite it stating that they do spawn here, that this is a regular habitat for it, which is weirdly small for a creature that lives in the ocean, or Carvanha who lives in rivers. No, I have only seen the Alpha Sharpedo here, straight from 1 to 100 in terms of terror and aggressiveness. Not only that, but I will also never forget when I first entered this area and both of these fish started to launch themselves onto land and continue to follow me. They did not flop onto the ground like Magikarp. No, they continued to chase me with everything they had, as they were determined to turn me into their next meal, their chum. And of course, my live stream chat was laughing at me, asking, well, what does this mean for the ecology? It means that everyone is to stay far away from wherever these Pokemon are. I don't care if it's the middle of the forest. I don't care if it's the ocean. It does not matter anymore. If they can launch themselves onto land, then you need to be far higher up in order to get away from their wrath and their gnashing teeth. That is, unless you're Tynamo, who is probably too small to be cared about. Though, it's actually really weird, nevertheless, considering Carvanha is here and is another aggressive predator, that if you make it past these very aggressive Pokemon that are hell-bent on eating everything and everyone that comes near them, you find yourself in the same area as one of the smallest Pokemon that we know of. The only explanation is that even if we are only finding 1 or 2 at a time here, there must be a group of them below the surface that are effectively turning this section of pool water into their turf. This can be supported as their information states that 1 or 2 don't generate much power, but a whole school of them, or a few of them linking together, can create a shock that is comparable to lightning. And if you're a Pokemon that resides in the water, I think you'd understand that it is in your best interest, in your livelihood even, in your health, to stay far away from the thing that will electrocute not only you, but everyone in the water if you upset it. Especially as this is the Tynamo's only known habitat within Lumiose. So effectively, despite how terrifying Carvanha and Sharpedo are, how Carvanha will just eat through boat holes and Sharpedo attacks literally everything that comes in its territory and eats it, these Tynamo are able to actually keep a stranglehold on them and ensure that they don't absolutely run wild, which makes sense why their habitat is here. They somehow made their way here and are being controlled, are being regulated by the Pokemon in this area. And this isn't the only one doing it, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Apparently, there are Staryu that are supposed to appear during the day here, according to Cerebi and Bulbapedia, but I only ever saw them at night, and it was just this little guy dancing on the stairs. You know, go, you do you, little buddy. But this is just another water Pokemon to help feed the predators here. Not that big of a deal, since Staryu don't care if their arms are eaten. They just regrow anyway. Though nearby within Blue Sector 9 is where Mega Starmie had appeared. And now you can find a great amount of Staryu in that secluded area that has an unobstructed view of the sky. It also seems as though with this area and the wild zone, that water is cleaned through the sewers and is used in wild areas such as this based upon the flow and drainage systems that we do find throughout this city. There are also 2 Pokemon that find their safety on the rooftops. The first of which is our avid guardian, who keeps an ever-watchful eye to ensure that none of the Sharpedo leap too high and enter the city by leaping over the roofs. And that is Watchog. And I gotta say, I love that its vest lights up whenever they notice us. It's something that I feel hasn't been properly shown until now, and it really adds to this Pokemon's aesthetic. They're just eating the flora up here, blinding anyone who is a threat, and then spitting seeds at them as their form of attack. They're effectively another gate of sorts, and are happy where they can stay up high and away from any form of surprise or threat. Unfortunately, they couldn't keep these rooftops entirely to themselves, as we have Arbok, who has made their way up here and taken over territory for itself. In fact, the other two fixed alpha Pokemon we see here are Watchog and Arbok, showing just how volatile the two Pokemon are with each other on these roofs, with Arbok of course being happy to capture and crush anything it can coil around. They've also really managed to make a mess of things as we see these poisonous mounds, something I haven't really talked about yet, but to explain them, these are the best sign of there being poison-type Pokemon in an area, as the poison Pokemon in general seem to produce these hazards as part of just what they do. I have a feeling that the Watchog may have even tried to push out any Ekans that may have been here, assuming that the Ekans and Patrat weren't already getting eaten by Carvanha and Sharpedo, and that's why they had to move up higher. And then, when there was continued conflict between Ekans and the Patrat and the Watchog and so on and so forth, that they would have originally been able to drive them out until Arbok came into existence. And with Arbok being very aggressive, all it takes is for one to keep pushing for that delicious meal of Watchog, then resulting in the massive alpha that actually marks this territorial separation between these two Pokemon on these rooftops. Unfortunately though, the Alpha Arbok is stronger by leaps and bounds, and these Watchog are active, or have to be active, at all times of day and night, just like the Arbok are here, in order to ensure that the army of them don't sneak up and wipe out the Watchog population. And I know what you might be saying, this feels a little bit cruel for them to be in wild zones, but again, I need to remind you that these zones were not made with the intent of creating a home for Pokemon like a zoo or a habitat that, they just threw together. These zones were made to contain powerful and dangerous Mega Pokemon, to find the readings of where the most dense energy is coming from, and then create a barrier around it. And all of these Pokemon turned these areas into their own habitats all on their own, while Lumiose City enabled their behavior. All because it was all that Quasarda could do, while they tried to keep things as secret as possible and worked towards a solution for the mega threats. The Saison Canal divides Wild Zone 11 into two separate areas. In the upper area, safe from pretty much every threat, unless it jumps up there, we find Slowpoke and a fixed Alpha Slowbro, which raises a lot of questions for me, because guess what Pokemon hasn't been seen within Legends CA whatsoever? That's right, Shelder, the Pokemon necessary for Slowpoke to evolve into Slowbro. But within the original Kalos Pokedex, we would find Shelder within the Coastal Kalos Dex. This would then mean that this Slowbro is an incredibly rare encounter normally, that it would have had to come originally from the coasts of Kalos and made its way here. And this is why in the Pokedex it is not noted to have a habitat within this city. And we can't say that Shelder are just incredibly rare, because we have Pokemon like Dragonair and Sliggoo who are considered very rare Pokemon, but are still noted to have a very specific area or general habitat within this city as per the Pokedex. Now, Shelder, though, doesn't appear at all. It doesn't float its way through the canals, and it isn't used by a singular individual within the main game whatsoever. I'm not going to say it's not in the DLC, because this game has put a major focus on giving two-stage Pokemon a third form. And while I don't believe it will give Cloyster a Mega, I'd rather not jinx myself, and watch us have two Mega Cloysters, considering Mega Slowbro is just a Mega Cloyster. I digress though, because it is through the extra effort of Alpha Slowbro that it is able to help keep its brethren safe and find food for itself, as the Shelder on its tail continually bites it and motivates our Slowbro here. Also, to be entirely fair, if it weren't for a Slowbro, and especially a Slowking, which is not here at all, at least in the wild, this Slowpoke will just die. They are very, very dopey, lovable, but very stupid creatures that will watch water go away, not follow it at all, and then proceed to dehydrate until they die. They need a leader to show them the way. Now, Slowbro being here is incredibly important, considering we do find a couple of different food sources that it and Slowpoke could fish for here, some being far more dangerous than others. Also, for note, this is the only habitat of Furfrou within the city, and it can be found on either side of this canal, which is an incredibly strange place to find it and leaves me with only two plausible explanations. Furfrou is a poodle, and poodles were originally the manliest dog there ever was. If you were a hunter, your job was to have a poodle as your hunting dog. This is because their hair is very special in the fact that they can run into the cold water, stay fairly warm, and then when they run out, their hair is able to be shaken almost entirely free from any amount of water that had collected onto them, ensuring that they do not get cold and they can continually be out in the cold despite running into the water. And this would then make the poodle the perfect dog for hunting waterfowl. But the problem with this is that, one, this is the city. You're not shooting ducks in the city. And two, there are no birds in this section whatsoever. And don't get me wrong, Furfrou is a dog. It's going to be eating anything and everything in this area, or at least trying to, especially since its fur is dense enough to help it resist physical attacks. The only other additional explanation for its presence here is that this is some kind of park, and there is an additional park nearby. So maybe the Furfrou just like these areas as they are a dog, being man's best friend, of course, and just want to take a stroll through here. Though as we make our way down from our vantage point and walk through the marshy edge line of the water, or rather just into the water in general basically, we find hidden within the thickets Stunfisk, the perfect little pancake just waiting for any Pokemon to step on it so it can joyously shock the life out of them and then be turned into its next meal. Unfortunately, a lot of the Pokemon here are very large or are staying far away from Stunfisk, so it is definitely waiting a long time in between meals, which isn't really that big of a deal. After all, the less you move, the less calories you need, so it can wait. Its meals may very well include our two small Pokemon here though, Clauncher and Inkay, and it is through Inkay's additional predation of crustaceans, which Clauncher absolutely is one, that we run into the issue of it being pressured into its evolution. This though isn't the only Pokemon here that is forced into evolution, as there are no Magikarp here, but instead only Gyarados. Meaning that because of the predation of Furfrou, Inkay, Stunfisk, and whenever Slowpoke magically remembers that it's supposed to be hunting or fishing for food, that we get the dangerous Gyarados and the Alpha Clawitzer here. And as a side note, one gripe I do have about this Pokemon game is the size of the Pokemon. So many of them are just abysmally tiny by comparison to their actual statistical heights, making them feel very underwhelming. And I would have chalked this up to Pokemon controlling their sizes due to the limitations of their habitats, like literally the Pokemon themselves controlling their own sizes or being limited in size due to the habitat. But when we get to some of our legendary Pokemon later, that logic falls apart completely. At least the alpha Pokemon are absolutely massive in size, and I'm happy about our giant chonkers. Back to Clauncher and Clawitzer though, they are Pokemon that will hunt after others. In fact, Clauncher is stated to shoot down any flying prey that enters its territory, meaning that there are most likely birds being shot down when they fly through here. This then causes a battle between Clauncher and maybe any Furfrou that would like to steal a meal, and re-solidifies our connection about poodles being hunting dogs, as Clauncher is our firearm, and thus ties why they are likely here, at least thematically. Though this strife, amongst all the other strife or battles that we've mentioned, will then create the Clawitzer that I've mentioned. And with a claw capable of blasting through metal, it kind of becomes a big threat in the big city here. Crazy fact is that both of our fixed alphas are much higher in level in comparison to our Gyarados, which makes me believe there's another reason as to why that serpent is here. Also, for clarification, yes, the Clawitzer is the other fixed alpha. Gyarados is born in lore once a Magikarp has experienced enough battles, of course, but rather more effectively when it has traveled up a waterfall that then causes the Magikarp to evolve. The Great Dragon Gate, if you would. And do you know what's a part of this wild zone? The tiniest waterfall known to man that does go under a bridge, very similarly to that of the Dragon Gate. thus at least making a joke as to why the Gyarados is so tiny here. And now there is one other Pokemon that will appear here as part of main mission 40, and that is Xerneas. And originally I was going to wait until the end to talk about it, but we're already in the zone it appears in, so why not just talk about it now, I say. When Xerneas approaches the city, Professor Mabel notes that there are spikes of energy appearing within the city all over. These spikes of energy are attracting Pokemon all over again, and have now resulted in 3 anomalous alpha Pokemon. This is a huge problem, as if this continues, we're just going to have the events repeat that we have seen before. And these 3 Pokemon are Steelix in Area 3, Gallade in 5, and Pangoro in 9. All Pokemon that do not make their habitats naturally within the city at all, or appear as alphas anywhere, with the exception to seeing them in Zone 20. These anomalous Pokemon have to be dealt with, and then we come back to this zone where we wait for the one that gives. And of course, the deer Pokemon appears near a stream of water, the majestic little monster that it is. Now, Xerneas being here is less about its actual arrival into the zone, and more about its effect on the city overall, and what it tells us about Mega Energy, Alpha Energy, General Pokemon Energy, and if you're inclined like I am, to explain Illumina Energy as well, and the connection between them all. Because Xerneas' power helps create Mega Pokemon, and even directly creates Mega Deontay in the movies. Funny enough, Deontay does come back within Legends ZA, and after having the event, catching it, battling it, you name it, we get to learn that the firing of the ultimate weapon causes Mega Stones to appear, which we kind of already knew, but to know then that the firing of the ultimate weapon from Lysander has now caused more Mega Stones to appear, thus affecting the general ecology and how Mega Pokemon appear overall. That all it takes is to fire this Mega Cannon a couple billion times, and every single Pokemon can have a Mega. Though that's a really bad idea, because all of that energy has to come from somewhere, and then all of that energy has to go somewhere. And of course, like I stated, at least within Pokemon Snap, it creates the Illumina Pokemon, in the case of Xerneas, of course. And here, it attracts Pokemon while also creating Alpha Pokemon, as we see within this mission. This effectively means that the general life energy of Pokemon is something that can create all of these things. That if there is excess energy in any amount, it has the opportunity to create Alpha Pokemon. Though this extends further into Pokemon like Totem Pokemon, Alphas in Hisui, and even the noble Pokemon of Hisui. But if you want all the nitty-gritty details on that, go check out my video. Now, you may have noticed, actually, speaking of videos, that this video is nearing its end, but I haven't talked about all the wild zones yet. Yveltal, Zygarde, the absorption of energy from Alola, Anj in its entirety, and so much more. And this is because, for the first time, I have to split this ecology into 2 parts. There's so much more to talk about than I can complete in this one singular video, and I want to make sure I'm not rushing it. You deserve quality. Plus, there may be details that I may have missed in what I talked about, and you can help inform me about. Meaning I can talk about your findings, give credit to you, and bring that up in the next video as we work to solve more of this ecology together. So drive up the views on this video in preparation for part 2, because more views means that I can, do more with the channel. But I won't leave you without something really fun to end on, because the last thing I want to talk about today is a bit speculative. And by the time the next part comes out, we'll get to know more about the Mega Dimension just a little bit. Because in the climax, when Anj fires its own Light of Ruin equivalent to the ultimate weapon's full power, Mega Zygarde uses Nihil Light on it. This clashing of pure energy on opposite sides is not something that just works in theory. In fact, we can compare this to the long-held theory of Lantern, a Pokemon not seen in the game save for one visual within the lab of Mabel, because this Pokemon can release so much light at such a deep level underwater that the sheer amount of energy being released within such a dense area can result in a black hole. Yet when Nihil Light hits this Light of Ruin, there is no black hole. Instead, I'm going to claim this is how we got Hyperspace Lumiose. And this is why Lumiose City is being eaten alive by hyperspace. All that energy and pressure didn't necessarily get sent away. It ripped a hole through space-time into hyperspace, which is Hoopa's domain, and of course that attracted the attention of Hoopa, giving us our Mega Dimensions DLC. A dimension that was ripped open thanks to Mega Energy. But that covers everything for today, and I am already working hard on the second part to this. Forgive me if I call it something like the legendary ecosystem of Lumiose City, or something like that, because just slapping a part 2 in the title is kind of a big no-no, and I want these videos to, of course, do well. But we'll start off real strong next time, I assure you. So, with that then, if you enjoyed and you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Please do make sure that you do subscribe to the channel. Again, weekly videos, weekly deep dives, and I love doing this so much. In addition, like I said, leave some comments behind about any thoughts that you have, as comments and watch time overall help boost the reach of a video, and you can always hype the video as well, which puts it on a leaderboard for hype. It's a weird thing still. And if you'd like to go the extra mile and support the channel monetarily, you can become a member for as little as $3 a month, which helps me increase the quality of the channel overall and gets you certain perks such as behind the scenes content, early access to videos primarily, and of course hearing your name at the end credits of every single video, which we're going to go do right now. Thank you to all of our members of the channel, starting with the Gods of Hope, Krill, Final Fantasy 14, Heals for Life, Biggins, Vatty, Knit, Buzz, and Summer, then the champions, Nia Scosta, and Joshua Biggins Wilson, with all of our Knights of the Court to follow with Crumbo, Vatty Lemon, Zoomster, Kelsey, Hoover, Covers, Luke Sassy, Vio, Shiny Gem, Sarah Bruce Boys, Fix My Nitrogen, Krill, Final Fantasy 14, Plow, Allen, Heals for Life, Bass Molder, Blue Dalek, Warren, Heffel, and Nature 9000, and then all of the wanderers of the channel, Yagal, Cal, Star S, Lumina Malroth, Zach Arrowwood, Rita Young, Samarfe, Nadra, Starbreed, Bob D. Fish, Gangle Frez, Tyrone Jones, Electro Lucario, Alive R360, Bex, Nicole Makayo, Justin Patrick, Just Bad, Byron Nilly, CGA, Planet Blob, Evan, Electric Solar, Beelzebub, Ruby, Jelon Dean, Desporty Yamper, Zalix, Keep Moving Forward, Suki Satsuki 232, The Black Dragon, Knit, Ruthless Hauser, Michael Stein, Jacob Square, Mr. Helagonal Gibbs, Super Saiyan Son Goku, Vanny Samaru, Max Supreme, Shadowhawk 19, Lost Mysteria, Zakai, Pyro Master, Abdallah Aladi, Gaming Roots, Night Owl 707, Evil Chan, Micah 626 Gaming, Nicole Manassian, Kristen Sandwich Boss, Emmy, whatever this is, Alona Family, Manico TH73, Sydney House, Missouri, Dakota Couch, Brad, Sundimer, Drixo, Carl Jean, Hunter Al, Hussein Kassam, Rebecca Connell, Hugh, Jappy W, Mitchell Morton, Marshy, Edward Kosowski, Fennec Fox, Hag, Adikadabra, King Pie, Jack and Frost, Versus Timey, Addie C, DJ Monk 23, Squidwater, Rye Smith, Gamer, Just J, M, MD, Horse with a Cocktail, Muse, Art Will, Tulumio, East Canada, 772, Andrew Frost, Peak Anonymous, Summer Slot, Nokia, and Ian Ray, Big and C9, Corner of the Cobb, Sleepy Bear, Jericho, Michael Vale, Unseelie King, The Florian Skies, Daniel Tracy, Karen Hoffman, Dylan Peters, Malachi Burkhardt, otherwise they Ron J, and even Toby Aspic. I'm gonna cough now. I'm still getting better. I'm still recovering. But thank you all for being members of the channel. It means the world to me. Also, you guys should stop into the streams at some point. I need to see y'all. I need to see y'all in the live stream chat at some point so I can talk with all of y'all, because I've never even had a conversation with some of you, and yet here you are supporting the channel by being members of the channel. It's wild to me that you guys are like, which I appreciate. It means, again, it means a lot. I do intend to start finally doing the ZA Nuzlocke in this next week, which is before my birthday, which is going to be crazy. My birthday is on the 11th, so this is going to be fun. But with that then, I hope you're excited for the conclusion of this, because I have to go make part 2 really soon here. Maybe I'll release it before the weekend, who knows. But with that, as always, don't think I would do. Please be nice to each other. I love you, and I'll see you next time.